I glanced down at the clock on my dashboard. 10:02, it read, in glowing green numbers amidst the darkness. Almost 30 minutes on the dot since we had entered the town. It was a nondescript little place. Short, squat, gray and brown buildings with signs introducing local businesses, lining the streets in the areas where small but homey residential houses bunched close together amidst well-kept lawns were not. Nothing too picturesque, but a standard Rust Belt town that, although it had clearly seen better days, had kept on chugging until it was a passable, if not at times a pleasant place to live. I knew the type well. My own hometown in central Illinois had been much the same. Beyond that, I was familiar with this very town, having passed through it on my way to the campsite with my friends, Phil and Clay, and I had spent the weekend at. It reminded me of days past, the sort of place frozen in time. It was that familiarity, perhaps, limited though it was, that made the place stand out to me on the way to our campsite. The town marked the 4-hour point of our drive, and had been made as something of a landmark as we had determined to stop there for gas and some snacks on the way back. Yet as we pulled off of the empty highway, the first thing that had begun to grip me was the silence. From the moment that we had entered the town, driving down what seemed to be the main road through the place, we had been greeted by nothing more than the staggering silence and a smell that seemed to linger faintly. There are few things that can truly, deeply unnerve a person. One of those things is true and utter silence. I'm not talking about the silence of a quiet home, with neighbors' cars and distant yapping dogs audible from beyond your walls. No, true silence, especially in a place where there ought to be the opposite. That was what we experienced rolling back through the town that had previously been as busy as any other along the highway. With the exception of my vehicle and that which carried my friends behind me, there was nothing. No distant roar of traffic on surrounding streets, the odd squeal of a brake, a honk of a horn, and a call of a pedestrian. It was more than just a lack of noise, however. There were no birds or joggers or people walking their dogs, no cars in the road. I felt an uneasy twinge in my gut, like something plucking at a loose fabric, and I found myself turning to my passenger seat to speak to my wife, an active habit before finding it empty. Of course, I recalled the feeling of reacquainting myself with reality, a bitter one. She's not here. That's the whole reason you're on this trip. The camping trip had been Phil's idea following my divorce, as a way to get me out of the funk that they had insisted I had entered, and he and Clay had battered me with it until I reluctantly gave in. We had spent a week campground hopping around the state, and were making our way back towards our homes in the exurbs of Chicago. We had passed through the town on our way to one of these state parks much farther south, and it had stood out to me. It had been a relatively quiet place then, but still with plenty of folks out and about. It seemed like the kind of town that still had a local hardware store not called Ace or Home Depot, and folks had Sunday breakfast at the local diner. And on our first pass through, I felt myself oddly drawn to it in a sort of nostalgic way that made me think of better bygone days. I resolved that it would be one of our pit stops on the way back upstate. The plan had been to fill up at the gas station, maybe stop for breakfast at a little local watering hole before continuing on our journey, and recharging our batteries in this Rockwell painting of a town. Part of me, the part seeking any logical explanation until the point of illogic, thought perhaps it was all an effect of the weather, both the impossibly sudden emptiness of the place and the sort of surreal, almost dreamlike disquiet that seemed to hang in the air everywhere. It had been staggeringly sunny on our initial pass through, a rare sort of day in Illinois as the summer allowed an early peek through the spring, whereas now it was overcast. Angry gray clouds hung overhead, growing blacker and more foreboding by the minute, with them a feeling of static in the air, and a breeze carried through the empty streets, lone and errant, and on it a chill of winter. A larger part knew how ridiculous that thought was. I had seen some bad weather in my day, even a few historic blizzards, and yet I had never seen an entire town utterly empty. And yet, the last 10 minutes had been spent driving slowly along the main road, my car in the lead as we retraced our previous steps through what seemed to be the main plaza of the quiet town. A sign painted on a dull green background, tucked with a floral display read, "Welcome to beautiful Criers Creek, Illinois. Population 4,673. As far as I looked, I saw neither hide nor hair of a single one of those almost 5,000 people. Lights remained shining through storefronts with no one to man them. The stoplights turned red, then green, then yellow all the same, though the road was deserted but for our 2 vehicles. Cars remained in parking spots lining the streets, somehow feeling like old and ancient fossils, their presence made ominous in the terrible silence. A choice few rumbled feeling much like a pack of grumbling beasts in waiting as their engines ran idly. They made my gut tighten like a fist, a pool of anxiety forming of a steady drip at the back of my mind. The sudden chime of my phone shattered the relative silence, making me jump in my seat. For the first time since entering the town, for the first time in a while, I was glad to be riding alone and no one could see my jumpiness. "Phil," the screen read, urging me to answer or deny the call. I did the former. "Hey," I answered. I still squinted as I peered out the window. I still expected or hoped might be a better word for it, to see someone, to catch some glimpse of motion passing behind a window, or catch a distant eye watching from a window as if this were all some trick the whole town was in on. "Hey." Phil's voice was unusual, shakier, with a tinge of emotion not characteristic of him. I was reluctant to call it fear, but... "Listen, either Clay and I are losing our minds." We rounded a corner, onto a street leading to a roundabout centered around what was clearly the town park. A statue of some long-dead figure sat atop a horse, with the sword drawn and face stern was the only facsimile of life visible. "Or there's literally nobody in this town but us." I felt the blood in my veins go cold at hearing the uneasy realization spoken aloud, as though the strange reality was made concrete in doing so. "Yeah," I spoke reluctantly. It looks like it." "Guys, I'm not gonna lie, bro." Clay's voice came over the line, and even through the phone I could hear the palpable disquiet heavy in his tone. "I'm getting an awful feeling about this." An icy chill rippled through me at that. He wasn't wrong, of course. Since we had entered the city limits, the air had felt almost charged with an uneasy, surreal sort of energy. It was the sort of feeling that you get in a place that had just experienced great tragedy or upheaval. If you've ever walked through the remains of a house burnt in a fire or seen a town rendered unrecognizable by a heavy storm, you know the feeling. As though every inch was a warning of how vulnerable we all truly are, a stark reminder of our own fleeting nature. And yet as we moved through those streets, taken by a silence that could find no logical explanation for, with every bit of daunting unease that I felt, there seemed a greater, nagging sort of curiosity. Something about it all bothered me, the suddenness of it. Places don't just up and desert like that. People don't all just leave the homes and jobs in town they've known and loved. No, There felt like there was something more to it, and for some reason I felt compelled to know what. I nearly leapt from my skin as the radio kicked to life, filling my car with the croon of a sudden unfamiliar voice. I squinted hard at the radio, which had ceased working from the moment that I had entered town, as though it might somehow explain the sudden interruption, which was over just as soon as it had started. On the other end, I could hear a similar burst of sound, followed by Phil's cursing in surprise. "This town is a dead zone for signals. Radio's on the crapper. My data's cutting in and out. Where are we going anyway, man?" There was a diner that I saw when we passed through the first time. Cute little spot. Reminded me of where Jenna and I first. I swallowed the sudden knot in my throat, surprised by the emotion that I felt at the memory. It reminded me of a spot that I used to eat at in college. There was silence from the other end, and I could all but see the looks passed between them at the mention of my ex-wife. A mixture of concern and mild irritation. "Well, it doesn't look like there will be much in the way of service," Clay chimed in. Of course I knew he was correct, and yet in the moment, the idea of turning back somehow filled me with an unusual sort of apprehension. It was the feeling one has when forgetting some important meeting or gathering, aware only that it slipped their mind but not of what or how. Probably, but I would still like to try to check it out. "Come on, boys," I offered, trying my best to lighten the mood. "Where's your sense of adventure?" After a moment of silence, Clay responded, "Okay, lead the way. See you then." And so I did, navigating the stark emptiness of the streets with them in tow, only the faint whistle of the wind moving between the buildings and the creak of wavering streetlights, none of which seemed to follow any discernible sort of pattern, only working in seemingly random intervals. Every so often the radio would spark to life, only to sputter off just as quickly. I tried to keep my eyes on the road. There was something about the lifelessness of the buildings that seemed to play to one's imagination. If I let my eyes linger too long, I could swear that they were figures, barely more than a shadow and only there for a moment, darting behind curtains and walls. After a few minutes we arrived, pulling into a parking lot with a few dozen cars scattered throughout, as if from some morning breakfast rush that we couldn't see. After a moment to muster my confidence, I stepped from the car, making my way across to the door. There was only the sound of my feet sliding across the pavement, and the rumble of the car behind me. A smell filled the air, like that of an old television set. Ozone. The word emerged like a thought whispered from somewhere. Behind me, Phil and Clay pulled into the lot quickly, stepping from the car and following behind me, muttering to themselves. As I arrived at the door, I felt confusion give way to apprehension, and a cold sweat began to bead above my brow. The doorway had been blocked, doors and chairs all piled in front in some makeshift excuse for a barricade. The three of us paused for a moment as Clay and Phil caught up, a glance passing between all of us that seemed to carry a different meaning in every eye, though all expressed in obvious disquiet. I knocked on the door, peering in through the dust-covered window for any sign of who might have piled all of the furniture, but found only an empty diner, half-eaten meals, cell phones, and a lone laptop all set around, the signs of life in motion yet with none of their owners to be found. I tried to stifle the chill I felt as the skeletal fingers of dread seemed to run along my spine gently. "Help me push this," I implored, grunting as I positioned my shoulder against the door and began to push with great exertion. The two looked at each other for a moment before Phil gave a shrug, his eyes meeting Clay's in a look that seemed to say, "We might as well," before adding his effort to my own. The door gave a hiss as we managed to pry it open almost half a foot, sending the chairs piled on the other side clattering to the ground in a cacophony that made my heart lurch. Such a sudden change from the utter silence. I coughed, once then twice as my throat stung for a moment, that odd ozone smell seeming to grow stronger on the breeze. "You think this is a good idea?" Clay asked, still standing behind us. His arms were crossed and there was a look on his face that I didn't like. It made me feel analyzed, like I was back in those marriage counseling sessions that had done nothing, being mentally picked apart by my wife and therapist, who it seemed both only existed to point out my every flaw. I bit back a retort, tasting the venom at the back of my throat, and swallowing hard despite the irritation, his attitude rising like floodwaters. I think there's a ton of people that just up and disappeared. I think that's something I can't just drive away from. I raised an eyebrow. "You're a biology professor, for the love of God. Shouldn't you have like some sort of scientific curiosity or something?" Clay narrowed his eyes in a look of mild irritation, pursing his lips for a moment before muttering a few expletives and adding his strength to ours. The door and the tables piled on the other end groaned in protest as we pushed it open as far as it would go. One by one, we slipped through the opening and into the diner. The fluorescent lights hummed and crackled, seeming to grow brighter as we entered, bathing the sky blue wallpaper and vomit green tile on the floor in a hospital-esque glow. It somehow made the situation feel all the more surreal and unwelcoming, pairing with the silence to turn what otherwise seemed your common small-town diner into an utterly unfamiliar and alien place. Outside, the wind seemed to pick up on the surreality that seemed to fill the air and made the windows groan in protest against it. And Clay made his way towards the counter, ringing the lone bell several times. "Enough, man, Christ," Phil chided. "There's nobody here." Clay shrugged before climbing onto the counter. "What are you doing?" I demanded, as Clay slid over the counter, still bearing half-finished coffees and meals, and on to the other side. "Making a coffee," he grunted, grabbing an untouched sausage from one of the plates and taking a bite. I felt the need to argue, but after a moment I could think of no reason why. The place was abandoned. It wasn't like anyone was coming. And yet I couldn't help but feel the need to be silent, as though any overwhelming noise might attract the attention of, well, that didn't feel quite as clear. "Coffee, boys? Anyone?" Clay asked, waving his cup at us and spilling a bit on the linoleum. Phil nodded and Clay made his way back to the machine. I muttered "no thanks," continuing around the diner. A laptop a few tables away had caught my attention. It was open, the screen still glowing, though it was dim. I made my way closer, eyeing it suspiciously. Beside it sat a set of keys and a wallet. I couldn't help but feel a chill at the sight. All things that nobody would leave behind unless left without a choice. We shouldn't be here. The thought forced itself through my head, and I tried to dismiss it, curiosity still burning. And still, I found myself sliding into the booth in front of the laptop, celebrating silently that it was still open. On the screen, I immediately recognized the Facebook Messenger, having had to answer plenty of "Hey, we're here if you need anything" messages from folks that I hadn't heard from in years after my divorce. I felt a twinge of unease as I realized I was reading someone's messages. This was certainly already an invasion of privacy, to be sure, and now it felt even more so. Still, I continued, pushed on by an almost feverish need to understand what was happening. As I began to read, I felt icicles forming along the walls of my veins, my blood turning to icy slush, my insides to liquid. The account belonged to a Dan Almond, a slightly older gentleman in his mid-50s, and the messages were between him and another man, Kevin, who was clearly his son. Earlier ones made it clear the kid was away at college. I love you, kiddo. Your mom loves you too. We all love you so much and I'm so proud of you. The first message sent that day read, There's something going on here in town. I can't explain it. It don't seem anyone can. But I don't think your mama and I are gonna be there for graduation, bud. I'm sorry. Just don't come home. Don't come back to Criers Creek. Ain't nothing good here for you anymore. Dad, are you okay? What's going on? I've been getting messages and seeing things on Snapchat all day about something flying over the town. Is Mom okay? She's with me, kiddo. We're together. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't even know myself. I just know that we can't go outside. People are disappearing, pulled up straight into the sky like a rapture. But I don't think this has nothing to do with God. I saw Mr. O'Reilly yanked straight off the ground, heard him scream until it stopped all of a sudden. His son's responses came soon after, frantic and questioning, followed by a call that wasn't answered. Dad, pick up. Who's Mr. O'Reilly? Dad, please pick up the phone. I'm sorry, you got no idea how much I'd like to hear your voice right now, but we have to be quiet. I'm at the Larry's with your mom. The folks here have got the doors all barricaded up. Can't help but think it won't do much good though. I felt a cold creeping up along my spine, a cold awful dread sowing itself deep into the fields of my mind. I can hear it now over us. Dang thing sounds like a truck. I love you, kiddo. Never forget it. It was the final message sent from Dan. There were a few more from his son, desperate and pleading for a response, followed by a string of calls that went unanswered and then nothing. I took a breath, feeling an uneasy tremor developing. The sounds of clinking plates and glasses as Clay and Phil cooked themselves breakfast seemed to fade to the background, as I found myself reading the conversation again and again. Any doubts that I had had as to whether or not something awful had happened here faded rapidly. I still can't be certain what drove me to make the call. Perhaps it was the unease, and the hope that somehow the young man would be able to offer some rational explanation, perhaps even explaining how his father had been mistaken, and how the town had been evacuated due to a gas leak or some mundane reason. It may not bode well for us, but the longer that I sat there, the less I felt anything would, and at least that response might quell the rising dread that I was feeling. It was like being a child again, a fear of something nebulous and formless yet dreadfully present all the time. The chime of the call ringing filled the diner, drawing both other sets of eyes toward me, both asking the same silent questions. After a moment, there was finally an answer. Hello? The voice belonged to a man who couldn't have been older than 20-something. Hi, is this Kevin? There was a pause. Yes, who is this? I felt a twinge of unease at the tone of his response, questioning, but not nearly as worried as I'd expect someone to sound receiving a call from a stranger on their apparently missing father's Facebook. I'm a friend of Dan's, I lied, hoping that it didn't sound quite as obvious as it felt. There was another silence, longer than before, and in it I could swear the tension was palpable. It was as if I could hear the gears turning in his head. I don't know any Dans. Sorry, man, you got the wrong guy. My heart struck hard against the inside of my chest as I tried to swallow the unyielding knot of dread that had formed in my throat somewhere along the way. Phil's questioning look grew worried, surely seeing the fear on my face. Clay's irritated and uneasy as he mouthed "What?" in my direction, clearly wanting to be caught up. Feeling the creep of anxiety as it began to brim over, and unsure of what else to say, I elected for the uneasy truth. Your father Dan. I found his laptop in a diner in a town called Criers Creek. I think something may have happened to him. Listen, man, I told you you've got the wrong guy. I never knew either of my parents. I got no memory of them. There was some palpable emotion at the end of his words that I could tell he was trying to restrain, and yet it felt as though he was telling the truth. Or at least the truth as he believed it, despite the evidence the previous messages laid out. It made my skin crawl and stomach tighten like a fist, an inhuman dread gripping me firmly in its clutches. The wind outside grew heavy, and the windows all seemed to yawn and groan in simultaneous protest, the sounds forming a frightful symphony. I peered outside one of the windows that stretched along the walls on either side, and could see nothing in the empty streets and even less in the skies above. The clouds all seemed to threaten of an approaching storm, the sort that transformed streets into rivers and fields into swamp, a force capable of changing the face of the earth beneath it. And yet, not a raindrop was to be seen, just clouds behind which, if I looked for too long, I thought I could see shapes moving within, large and darker even than the surrounding gray, but gone as soon as I thought they had appeared. I searched for something, anything to say that would lead to a rational answer. It had always been in my nature, let my ex-wife tell it, a need to be right that made confusion feel all but unacceptable. I've never seen how it could be a negative, the pursuit of knowledge. Now I wonder if perhaps I simply refuse to. He doesn't remember his father. The thought rang like a question to which I could find no answer. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to ask you not to contact me again, please. Good luck with whatever. Wait, please, The laptop chimed with a cheer that I didn't feel as the call had ended. I tried again, but there was no answer, and before I could go for a third, the account had been blocked. What was that all about? Clay asked, his unease apparent, eyes darting between myself and Phil, who didn't look any better himself. I could think of nothing else to do but tell them the truth. When I was through, there was silence for a moment that seemed to linger for hours between the three of us. We need to go, Phil finally chimed. If any of that is true, then we need to get out of this place now. Clay nodded, sliding his plate away and making his way over the counter and towards the door. To my own surprise, I felt a bloom of apprehension, feeling an argument building inside of me. They were right, obviously. Something was going on that I could make no sense of, and yet, still I wanted to understand. People don't just disappear. None of this was possible. And for reasons that still escape me, I felt driven to prove it. Yet the look on their faces, it made me uneasy. It was the face you would expect from the crew of a ship far too long at sea, to the captain who had denied them a return home. The entire trip had been for me, and though I may not have called for it, it was certainly my decision to visit this town, and my choices that had kept us there. Something told me that disagreement might not be an option at this point. I stood and slid from the booth, casting one last glance at the laptop before nodding my agreement. Clay gave a brief nod, and had turned to open the door when, boom. There was a sound like a train derailing, or a bomb going off, or both, somewhere close by, that sent all three of us scattering along the ground. The windows shook and the air itself seemed to vibrate with a sound like nothing that I had ever heard, a strange, all-present sort of hum that seemed to come from everywhere. My eyes darted wildly about the room in my utter panic, searching for the cause, and I could swear that I caught a glimpse of something outside. It was quick and massive, moving about the sky as if unaffected by gravity. But as that awful hum grew, I shut my eyes tight, trying to will away the ache in my skull. That smell from earlier, like burning ozone, grew thick until everybody was coughing uncontrollably. My head spun and my vision shook. Another explosive sound rocked the air, shattering several of the windows. As quickly as it began, everything ended, the world going eerily still. I don't know how long it was before any of us felt comfortable moving, but Clay was the first, shooting to his feet and hissing a string of expletives. His arms ran with scarlet ribbons of red trailing between his fingers as he picked out the glass that had caught him. He had been nearest to the door, which had burst with the first few windows and caught the worst of it, though all of our heads rang and stomachs turned with nausea. What was that? Phil managed. His eyes were wide, with a look that I had seen on pictures of war veterans or victims of some disaster. A glassy, faraway stare. There was something in the sky. What was it? His voice shook as though he was close to tears. I don't know, I answered, surprised by the sound of my own voice. We should call the cops or something, the National Guard, the Air Force, Clay cried, his voice cracking as fear and panic still overwhelmed him. I nodded, head still throbbing and mind racing as I went for my cell phone. A feeling like cold water being dumped overhead made the blood freeze in my veins. No signal. I shook my head. There's no service. Clay's face contorted into a look that was a mix of surprise, denial, and terror. As he pulled his phone from his pocket, Philip did the same, hand shaking all the while. No one said anything, the two of them staring at their phones with variations of the same expression. They didn't need to say a word. I knew what it meant. Let's just go, I said. I struggled to my feet, the world seeming to spin beneath me for a moment as I gripped a chair for balance. I helped Phil to his feet, his eyes never once leaving the skies beyond the broken windows. And Clay led the way, grimacing as his arms continued to run with blood. As we made our way outside, I could tell immediately that something was deeply wrong. That smell hung thick in the air still, but it was more than that. The streets were emptier than before. They're gone. Everything is gone. And Clay spoke the thought aloud, just as a cold and awful realization dawned on me. The cars were gone now, both the empty vehicles that had previously lined much of the streets, and Clay's own truck, all gone. All of the vehicles but for one, my own sedan, left idling in the middle of the street. With all that happened, my memory was spotty, but I felt certain that was not where I had left it. Clay shook his head, moving aimlessly about the street, head on a swivel, searching for his vehicle to no avail. Finally, he let out a scream, long and full of rage that echoed through the empty streets. Phil just kept shaking his head, muttering something to himself. I hardly had the time to react as Clay made his approach, throwing up my hands to partially block the punch he threw. I felt a shock in my jaw, and for a moment I felt heat in my face. For a split second, the world disappearing behind darkness and flecks of light. The commotion seemed to kick Philip from his stupor, and he grabbed a hold of Clay, pulling him away from me. "This was your idea," he cried, accusation heavy in his tone. I ran my hand along my jaw. My lower lip was bleeding slightly, but I was otherwise okay with the exception of the sting in my face. I know that I ought to have left it alone, but I was scared and angry, days and months of emotions coming to the surface. "You didn't have to come. I didn't make you listen. What is wrong with you?" I cried, taking a step closer. Clay laughed, but it was a sound without any genuine humor, mocking and belittling. "You're a snide, self-assured, horrible man. Always have been," he said, his words coated in a palpable venom. But even worse, a sort of confident assuredness that spoke of a conviction behind them, as though he had thought these things for quite a while. "It's the reason we're the only two people still willing to put up with you. It's the reason for where you are in life with that dead-end job. And it's the reason that Tracy left. You can't even consider someone else's right. You chide and make stupid comments until they finally give in to you. I wanted to feel something, anger, hate, an urge to hit him back even, but I couldn't. A part of me could only sit in the recognition that, in some ways, he was right. "Stop it, Clay, this isn't the time," Phil said, putting himself between the two of us. "We need to go," he turned to me. "We're going to have to use your car. Are you okay to drive?" I nodded, though my thoughts were still on Clay's own words. "Then let's go." Clay's eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I thought that I could see his expression softening before he turned and made for the car. I followed it until we reached the car. The faint winds moving through the buildings were the only noise to accompany us. My mind raced. Clay's words, the call from earlier, and whatever had happened in the diner all spinning through my head in a vortex of thought. But none of it made sense. This place, that thing in the sky, the cars, it was impossible. I knew that as we left it behind, it would always bother me, like a picture left askew. This blind spot in what I knew to be possible. "Hello, hello, is anyone there?" A voice echoed through the empty streets, a woman's by the sound of it, carried from somewhere that seemed both near and distantly behind us. It froze all three of us in place. The same question passed slightly between us as though nobody wanted to be the first one to ask whether anybody else had heard it. "Hello?" The voice again, except this time I felt certain it was somewhere ahead. Phil snapped to face it, the fear that had seemingly dissipated slowly returning to the surface, his eyes darting around nervously. And Clay looked at me hard, shaking his head slowly as though he could hear my thoughts. I narrowed my eyes, holding back none of the bitterness that I felt. So some woman is alone wandering this place with whatever that thing is, and you want to leave her. Looking back, I can't account for the sudden defiance that I felt. Perhaps my ego had finally caught up with the earlier wounds, or perhaps the idea of leaving somebody here felt too much like the failure of my relationship. I can't be certain. Likely, I would need the help of a therapist over days of work to understand, and days I do not have. Clay looked as though he wanted to spit in my face, shaking his head, eyes filled with something cold and unrecognizing. "You're a fool," he said, "and you're gonna get one of us killed for it." He's right," Phil stammered, though he looked as though he dreaded the words. "It wouldn't be right to leave her." Clay scoffed, looking between the two of us and shaking his head. "Whatever," he relented, climbing into the back seat and letting the door slam shut behind him. Phil scanned the ground for a moment, sighing for a long moment before looking back at me. He's pissed, understandably, but I'm sure that he gets it. Let's just see if we can find whoever that was. He nodded for me to follow as he made his way towards the car, pausing for a moment. He met my eyes. "Just promise you won't get out of the car. We'll drive around and look, and if we can't find anyone, we go." I nodded. "Yeah, okay, I promise." And with that, he made his way into the car. I followed, feeling suddenly very claustrophobic in the vehicle, as we began to make our way through the streets. "Just listen for her," I said, rolling down all four of the windows as we began moving through the streets at random, listening for any sign of the person that we had heard before. At some point, I began calling out, much to Clay's dismay, shouting for anyone to respond. It wasn't long before eventually someone did. "Please help me, it's coming." That voice again, much more clear this time, coming from a few streets away within one of the residential areas. I veered left onto the road from where I could hear it coming. My foot settled on the gas, and unusual determination swelling in me as the calls grew louder, until we arrived outside a house. It was no different than the others, a single story, a red brick home, with all the windows drawn but one, and yet the sight of it sent chills down my spine. The front door sat wide open, yet I could see nothing inside. Clay was already shaking his head when I turned to face them. No way, look at that place, it's not right. He trailed off, unable to put the feeling to words. I knew what he meant, I felt it too. We all could, staring back at the entrance like the maw of some animal. And yet as that voice echoed from within, I felt stirred by an uncharacteristic sort of boldness. It's fine, I said. I'm not gonna push it. Just wait here, I'll be back. Clay scoffed and Phil just looked on with sad eyes, nodding almost to himself. Then I'm coming. Clay looked ready to explode, staring at Philip as though he had grown another head. You always go along with this BS, he said. Eyes narrowed as he looked at Philip. Whatever, I'm staying here, you two have fun. If you're not back in 10 minutes, I'm leaving without you both. I wanted to argue, but I knew it would accomplish nothing. So instead I gave a brief nod and exited the car. Phil hurried from the back seat, following behind, and I could hear the sound of the door's automatic lock as we made some distance. The closer we came to that front door, the more that I could see the house inside, with a standard foyer and living room. Nothing unusual but for the utter state of disarray that it was left in. Shelves were toppled and furniture overturned, various things scattered about the floor as though a tornado had somehow moved through the place. Somehow the opening felt eerie, as though what lay on the other side was more than a mere house, but some other world in which something awful had happened. A part of me wondered if Clay wasn't right, and considered turning back on the spot. But the idea filled my mouth with an awful taste of the satisfaction I knew it would bring him. So, spurred forth by my own ego, I stepped inside. The smell was immediate, like sitting too close to an old television set, just an acrid static that singed at your nose hairs. As was the feeling of a sort of chill that gripped me. It made my stomach turn with nausea, my vision buzzing momentarily. It looks worse than the diner when we left, Phil commented, looking over one of the few coffee tables still on its feet. I nodded, the implications of the thought making me feel uneasy. Broken glass crunched beneath my feet as I stepped forward, peering into the kitchen. On the wall hung a photo, a man and a woman and 3 children. I felt something shift in me as I wondered where all of the individuals were now, and if anybody would ever know. I wondered who it was that we had heard. There was another question that was clawing at the back of my mind, one that I didn't want to acknowledge yet and I couldn't ignore. Would we join them if I couldn't find her soon? Help me! The cry echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, sudden and shrill, making me jump as I spun to face it. Phil's reaction was the same, our eyes meeting as we searched for the source, settling on a door in the hallway ahead. Even at a distance, I could see the tremors that took him, and I didn't feel far off myself, but I was there for a reason. You don't have to follow me, I said in earnest as it began to make my way forth. Somehow, by the echo from behind the door, I knew there was a basement on the other side. I didn't have to look to know that Philip was behind me, breathing nervously and muttering barely silent prayers. I opened the door and we began to descend into the darkness below, hands feeling along the wall for a light switch. I felt something brush past my cheek, a string hanging overhead, and upon pulling it, a dim bulb sputtered to life, offering what little light it could manage. It did little to illuminate what lay in the basement beyond, only really serving to cast eerie shadows along the stairwell, but at least we could see where our feet were to land. Help me, help! That voice again, but not nearly as loud as before or as urgent. I felt one of those unearthly chills, as though my body were warning of something that I couldn't yet perceive, and it frightened me. Do you see her? Phil whispered, voice still shaking as he stepped behind me, kneeling slightly as if worried standing at his full height might attract something's attention. It took me a moment to realize that I was doing the same. No, I can't see a thing, I breathed back, gritting my teeth at the squeal of the staircase beneath my feet. Feeling its weight in my pocket, I remembered my phone. It had been all but useless since we had been attacked by whatever that thing was, but the function of a flashlight was the one thing I knew it could still serve. I shined the light onto the ground below, a gray cement slab that seemed to extend through the entire room. Help, please. That voice again, this time so small it was barely more than a whisper from somewhere around the corner. We turned into the basement, the light exposing a small hallway ahead, leading to a boiler room. In the hall sat a door, closed, though I could see a light glowing beneath it, and I could hear the woman's voice from within. I glanced back at Phil, his eyes never wavering from the door, and he simply nodded. We pushed forth. Help, please. The nearer that I grew to the door, the more my skin began to crawl. Something off about the voice in a way that I could only now process. There was an odd hiss to it, a mechanical crackle that I couldn't place. Hands shaking, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, only the glow of an old television set to prevent total blindness. Do you smell that? Philip asked. I nodded, the same ozone scent hanging heavy in the air. It took a moment to process what I was hearing, but as it began to click, confusion and dread filled me in equal measure. Help me, help, the voice echoed from the television. That doesn't make any sense, Philip said, voice no longer a whisper as a familiar dread filled his words. We heard it from blocks away. That's impossible. The light on the screen seemed to shine with such sudden force that it temporarily blinded us, bathing the room in an eerie white light, the old box set glowing like a supernova. The air seemed poised to set alight, the electric stench so strong that I could feel my lungs burning. There was another crash. The house shook, threatening to collapse in on us as that awful sound rocked the earth. The screen of the old television burst in a shower of sparks and glass, scattering across the room. Phil's eyes met mine, a primal sort of terror filling them as his hands clasped over his ears. Something like a shriek, ancient and animal, but put through a computer filter or something of the sort, pierced the air, seeming to come from everywhere at once. All I could do in those moments was cover my ears and pray until the awful cacophony ceased and the air took on that eerie stillness. It took a moment before either of us moved, myself first, scrambling for the phone that I had dropped in the commotion, before hurrying to help Philip up to his feet. What was that? What the heck was that? He asked, shock still working its way through him. Come on, I urged, pulling him towards the way that we had come, and answer already in my mind. We have to go check on Clay, now. That seemed to stir him, and the two of us raced out of the house, in worse condition than it had been before, and out into the front yard. The weather had seemingly shifted in the minutes that we had spent inside, the clouds dark and foreboding, wind whipping leaves from trees and lashing its tendrils across my face. The car was gone. The space that it had occupied almost mockingly empty, that stench filling the air. There was no sign of Clay, and something told me that there wouldn't be any longer. It got him. I hardly realized that I was speaking the words as I did, my mind putting two and two together. That thing tricked us, and it got him. The swell of emotion I felt threatened to send me into a freefall. He was here because of me, and we were on this trip for me, and it was my choice that had gotten him into this, and now... God, and now what? I couldn't even be sure of what I was guilty, couldn't even be certain whether I had gotten my friend killed, or simply whisked off to some unknown fate. He was right, Philip breathed, tears streaming openly as he stared at the spot the car had once occupied, as if at any second it could return, The wind picked up, sending ominous whispers through the trees and tracing an icy chill down my back. We should have left. We should have gone when we had the chance. It's gonna get us now. His tone was almost childlike, past the point of fear, almost as though he were stating the dreaded reality. I shook my head, stepping in front of him and gripping him by the shoulders. Phil, we have to go now. We can walk. I spoke, though in hindsight I think even I wasn't convinced by my own words. This place isn't that big. It would take maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. We could just stick to the main road and walk out of here. Phil laughed, a sound devoid of humor or mocking or any sort of emotion, cold and harsh. It's not going to let us go. It gave us that chance and we didn't take it. Don't you see? The skies above seemed to groan and rumble as warning of an approaching storm, and yet no signs of lightning were to be seen. The wind grew stronger, whipping my jacket about with such force that it almost moved me. Philip just shook his head, staring up at the sky. Too late. And then a crash. The air itself seemed to shake as a sound like the sky tearing open above us threatened to deafen me. The sky above was an ominous gray, every cloud swelling with the threat of a torrential rain, and at first I could see nothing but the sunlight filtered gray through the mist. And then there was movement. Brief at first, a flash of something dark enough that the sun couldn't pierce it, as it passed between an area where the cloud cover was just a bit lighter. Everything shook, my very bones seeming to move out of place as the sky seemed to split in half. In that moment, it cast a circular shadow almost 30 feet ahead, passing over the street like some new celestial body. If you've never seen something impossible, witness something your mind knows inherently to be wrong, no matter how hard it seems to grapple for some sort of understanding, you can never understand what I felt in that moment. I found myself grasping for answers, a nauseating sense of horror racking my body. It's a weather balloon, or I could find no words, every explanation falling flat in the face of the impossible. Its shape was circular, a perfect sphere with nothing resembling a wings or flaps or rudders. It was a pale white, so much so that it almost reflected the light like another sun in the sky. The air hung thick with the smell and taste of ozone, so much so that I couldn't help but cough violently. It was gone again, disappearing into the clouds. Moving with such sudden speed, I knew it depended on more than the wind. For several moments we saw no sight of it above, and yet the sound of its movement grew until the ground seemed to shake. It's coming closer, I spoke the realization, voice hoarse as I sputtered another cough, eyes meeting Phil's. He smiled sadly, and in that moment I understood that I had to flee. I didn't wait for Phil to follow, my legs pounding as I ran back towards the house and away from that thing. The entire world seemed to shake, the air itself somehow vibrating until I could feel it in my bones. A glance over my shoulder told me why, as I passed the side of the house we had just exited. I caught sight of the object descending until it was barely 30 feet or so off the ground. It was bigger than I had imagined, at least the size of 3 school buses in length, and by the look of it, it seemed entirely composed of some pale metallic substance, almost like a reflective marble. I lost sight of it as I neared the car, but I knew very well that it was directly overhead. It made a sound, like the bellow of some horrid ancient beast that had been run through auto-tune as it closed in on him, growing closer and closer until I could feel it, feel the static that seemed to radiate forth from it. It didn't stop, even as the mechanical roar rose to a fever pitch, combining with a human shriek to form a sound so awful, I'm sure that it would haunt me for the rest of my life, if I expected that to be long. I chanced a singular glance over my shoulder before passing beyond the house and into its backyard, and what I saw I still can't be sure of. It was as though Philip's body was dissolving, coming apart in ribbons of flesh. The air around it visibly warped by some sort of energy that seemed to pour forth from that thing, floating like another moon a few feet above his head. I kept running until there was nothing but the sound of my own breath and pounding heart, long after silence had settled over the town. As shock began to take effect, the adrenaline wearing off and leaving me feeling bruised, battered, scared, and alone, I found my way into the local public library. That's where I've been for the past few hours. I'm staying off the streets. It's not safe. That thing could descend on me at any time and do God knows what. I'm writing this because I've done all that I can to try and reach out for help, to no avail. There is little else in the silence for me to do but perhaps try and write some account of what happened here, in the off chance that anybody finds themselves wondering about the town of Criers Creek, or the even more unlikely scenario that they're wondering about me. To Clay and Phil's families, if you're seeing this and still remember them, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. And to whoever is reading this, be willing to trust the people around you sometimes, and stay away from Criers Creek. There is something in the skies above, something that has claimed this place as its own. Today's episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Now, how much do you think you're paying in subscriptions every month? The answer is probably a lot more than you think. Over 74% of people have subscriptions that they've forgotten about. And this has happened to me too personally multiple times, and every time I try to cancel them it always seems so difficult. But thanks to Rocket Money, I'm no longer wasting money on the ones that I've forgotten about. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. They make it easy to see all your subscriptions in one place and know exactly where your money is going. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. Stop wasting money on things that you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. That's rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. rocketmoney.com/MrCreeps. A small disclaimer. This happened a while ago. My memories of the following events were hazy just after it happened, so they may be even fuzzier now. Now on to the main reason that I'm telling you this. My town is a strange one. It's called Split City, though it isn't much of a city rather than a small town. And nobody outside of town will know what you're talking about if you ask for directions. We've been pretty much cut off from the world for 40 years. The only connections and communications that we have to the larger planet around us is the internet. Other than that, we don't get visitors. New people don't come to live here and nobody has ever left. It wasn't always this way. There was a military installation here in the 1970s and 1980s. Though it was abandoned in 1981, there was something about a contamination report being bad enough for even the shadiest parts of the government to say that the base was a major health code violation, and it was all locked down. Some people say they hear noises coming from inside every now and then, but I call BS on them every time. The people, chief among them being a boy my age at the time, 16, called Jay Williams, claimed that there was a monster in there and that whoever could go in there and come back out would be the bravest and toughest guy in the universe. They all claimed that they could do it, but once Jay said that they should actually do it, everyone backed out. One of them was Jay himself. He refused to say that he was making stuff up, but he also refused to back down from his claims that he was actually going into the bunker. That made me want to see how far he would take it, so I obviously told him that I would go. The second person to join us was, funnily enough, Sarah Williams, Jay's twin sister. The two looked like gender-flipped versions of themselves, even though they were fraternal. She was a bit less egocentric than Jay, and we actually got along, but that was where the differences ended. The twins got along like a house on fire, and they were evil geniuses when working together. The twins were about 5 feet and 6 inches tall. They had jet black hair and brown eyes, with speckles of orange spread throughout their irises. Both of them were lanky, but Jay was a bit thicker, as he had been really into exercising lately. Sarah's hair reached her shoulders and was a very wavy, curly mess. Jay's hair was also curly, but it wasn't very long, and he had a fade that didn't look too bad on him. I usually didn't like that type of hairstyle, but he made it work somehow. The fourth person to express interest in entering the military bunker was a younger kid named Ryan Deacon. He was a little ball of energy and couldn't stop fidgeting. I suspected that he was ADD, but I thought it would look bad if I asked him if he was special or something, so I didn't say anything. Ryan was scrawny like a twig and was the shortest out of the group. His hair was dirty blonde and it was shaggy, with choppy ends and one of his prominent bangs cut short, giving me a feeling that he did it himself. Ryan had the bluest eyes that I had ever seen, and it kind of unnerved me if I looked him in the eye, so I avoided that when possible. Ryan brought his friend, Hurley Rawlinson, along with him. Hurley was a bit pudgier than was average, but not overly so. He had the same haircut as Ryan, which made me think that they both did it on a dare or something. While I'm going through describing our party, I should probably talk about myself. My name is Caleb, and I was probably a bit taller than average for my age, rocking a whole 6 feet of height. I had chocolate brown hair which was unruly, which meant that I often gave up trying to brush it in the morning, letting it settle into the curly natural style that I had most days. My eyes were blue and I had a few bits of orange in them, just like the twins. I had read somewhere that it was an indicator of autism or being on that spectrum, which lined up with a few traits for all three of us. I was kind of bookish, being interested in urban legends and modern myths. It was my passion, and I would say that I knew every piece of knowledge that there was available to me. I talked about it often, which annoyed the few friends that I had and drove off potential new ones, so that was cool. So we had our party, but we needed a way to get into the bunker without being seen or getting in trouble with our parents. Hurley came up with the brilliant plan to tell each of our parents that we were sleeping over at the twins' house, and the twins would tell their parents that they were going to sleep over at a different friend's house, so we all had our alibis. In reality, these excuses were very flimsy as it was, and if even one parent wanted to do a reasonable thing such as call to check in on their kid, it would all fall apart, but it was the best thing that we had, so we stuck with it. Just like that, we were standing at the peak of the tallest hill in town, which was the entrance to the bunker. I've been saying bunker because it wasn't a traditional above-ground base. It's more than that hill was placed there to mask the bunker. The bunker went deep into the ground, deeper than even the hill's base. Nobody truly knew how low it went. I had heard a couple of stupid kids say that the bunker went to the Earth's core itself, and was trying to mine it for resources. It sounded cool, but nothing could withstand the heat, so it was a bust. Jay was ready to get going. We were all in winter coats because we knew it would be freezing cold inside. We knew that because the bunker had actually been opened up before, but only once. Nobody ever went inside. But they looked in and saw something that they didn't ever tell anybody that they didn't immediately swear to secrecy. He had described it as bone-chilling in both the mentally scarring and the physically cold senses. The twins had coats that were largely the same, with a few major differences so that we could tell them apart if it got too dark, to simply look at their face and see who it was. Jay's coat was red like his scarf. It was a gradient, with the bottom of his coat basically being black, turning into a bright red color as it reached the collar. Sarah's was the same except with green. She had a hairpin that was the same color, and I thought how cute it was that they had a theme, but wanted to come off as these tough urban explorer type people. Ryan and Hurley both had simple gray winter coats on, but they were easy to tell apart due to their height difference. I'm fairly sure that Hurley was closer to my age than he was to Ryan's, but that the only friend he could make was Ryan. I felt that, so I decided not to bring any of that up. Finally, my coat was black only because it had white trims, giving me a sort of reflective vest look. It would be easy to center on me, and I was okay with being that guy for our group. We checked over our gear. We had our flashlights, phones, sleeping bags, blankets, and food and water stuffed into our backpacks. I had the food, Sarah had the blankets, Jay had the sleeping bags, and Ryan had our water since it would be bad if one person had both and got lost. And Ryan held the batteries for our flashlights. Hurley held the portable chargers for our phones, and I was fairly sure that was the most important job of all. If we lost communication, we were dead. Not wanting to hold in his need for movement and energy, Jay opened the door in a massive, showy heave that went far over his head. The door opened upwards, though it was hard for him to do alone, and I ended up having to help him get it past the peak of its swing so that it would fall to the ground. Once we got it open, we had to decide who would go first. I could feel the temperature drop by a good 10 degrees when we opened the door, and I was sure that it was much, much colder inside. We all looked at Jay. "What? You want me to go first?" he asked. "Obviously, idiot. You're the one that was talking so high and mighty about how they were going to do it alone, so you might as well prove to us that you're good as your word and go first," I answered. Jay sighed heavily and knelt at the opening in the ground. It was circular, so we could all have looked down and seen what he saw, but we didn't. He gazed into the darkness that seemed to stretch forever downward, but it clicked for him to use his flashlight, like a person with a brain. He clicked it on and it became so much easier, as if that was its intended use, to see better in the dark. Jay looked down again and explained some words in French that I didn't understand. The twins' mother was French and she had been steadily teaching them the language since they were about 8. They were 16 now, so they were pretty much fluent in it, much to my dismay. They often used it to make fun of people in private, while saying it right to their face. Anybody could simply pick up a French to English dictionary, but that would ruin their fun, and that would be a crime against humanity. "There's a ladder, we could climb down it, but that would take too long, so I suggest that we..." Jay was cut off by me. "We are making a ladder slide again. You know that James broke his leg the last time that we tried," I told him sternly. Jay grumpily sat on the ground, mumbling something about me taking over from him and stealing the spotlight. I laughed a bit and took a look down the hole for myself, and true to Jay's words, there was a ladder that stretched further down than I could see. But it was the only way that we knew how to get into the bunker, so we had to use it. And I said as much to the party. "What? That sucks. I guess we have to, though," Sarah agreed. I went in first, followed by Sarah, Ryan, Hurley, and finally for some reason Jay. It was almost like he was BSing us back at school. I laughed at the thought of his frightened whimpers being the thing that got us found if we were to get lost down here. We made our way down. The task wasn't easy because of our slightly restrictive coats and our backpacks stuffed to the point of bursting. Eventually, about 5 minutes after first climbing down, we reached a new level in the bunker, it seemed. The cold had intensified, and I guessed that it was now about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I decided that we should take a break after 10 minutes. We had noticed that every 10 meters or so there was a small platform that had a door in the wall. We had never stopped at one because Ryan had asked if there could still be people down there working, and that dissuaded us from checking what was behind the doors. We sat down on the platform. Jay went to open the door to our left, but I stopped him with a yell. "What, man?" Jay asked. "Don't go in there. We have no idea if this place is radioactive or something. And going in this deep is already uncharted territory," I reasoned. "Oh, screw that. I want to explore," Jay said. Jay threw the door open and waltzed through it, moving into the darkness. I tried to grab onto his leg, but he moved too fast for me. Sarah chased after him, so that was 2 out of our party that was gone. This was happening too fast for me to think rationally, so I chased after them as well. The 3 of us ran down the corridor, shouting at each other to shut up and agree with whatever we were all saying. It was confusing for a moment, but Jay stopped in his tracks while looking back at us. But he wasn't looking right at us, he was looking behind us. I stopped and turned around, hearing the sounds of Sarah crashing into Jay, and saw that the door was slowly closing. It was moving, but I couldn't see Ryan or Hurley moving it. I started running back to it, and as I was sprinting toward the shrinking light, I saw a head peek around the door. The head looked like a person's, but it was white as a sheet of paper. Its eyes were beady and glowing yellow. It had the fangs of a spider, and the thing's jaw was unhinged like a snake. I couldn't see any more of it than that, but I'm sure that it was a disgusting amalgamation of creatures that broke numerous laws of nature, science, and the universe. The door closed just before I got to it. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I don't recall there ever having been a lock on the door, but this thing had somehow locked the door from the outside. "What the heck?" Jay asked. "I don't know, there was something there and it closed the door." "It's locked," I said, trying my hardest not to panic. "There was a thing?" Sarah asked. "It was this nasty-looking thing with a jaw that opened way too wide. Its eyes were glowing and I think it smirked at me," I yelled. "Well, we're screwed," Jay said, which didn't help the tiny panic attack that was happening with me in the corner. "No, we still have our phones, right? That means that we can call Ryan and Hurley. If they don't pick up, we'll call somebody on the outside to come and get us. Do we know what level we're on?" Sarah thought out loud. "That's brilliant. We're on sub-level 30, and there's about a 30-foot gap between levels. So that means we're about 900 feet in, give or take a couple dozen feet." I did the math. It added up to me and Sarah wasn't arguing. "What? That's insane. We can't be almost 1,000 feet underground. The hill isn't that big," Jay screamed. "You have to remember that the hill is probably just a cover for what they built down here. Maybe they wanted to start at ground level, but the people in charge said that it was too deep, and they had to start a bit above ground to satisfy their bosses," Sarah offered. "Yeah, that checks out. We need to see if we can get any phone service down here first," I said, pulling out my phone. We all checked our phones and none of us could use anything other than a flashlight and the clock, which told me that it was midnight on the spot. I almost laughed at how weird it was that we got trapped just as the witching hour came upon us. I didn't laugh, though if I did, the twins would surely think that I was having a psychotic break or something. "Okay, what do we do next?" I asked. Jay and Sarah ruminated for a moment and they both looked at each other with glee in their eyes, which worried me. The only time that this had happened was when the two had been asked to participate in the demolition of their grandfather's house after his passing. "If we can get a big enough object, we could try breaking the door open. If not, we can try the same thing except for sharp things, Jay said. Exactly, Sarah agreed. That's insane, and you both need professional help. We aren't going to destroy this place. We need to find a safe way out, and I think the only way to do that is to explore and look around to see if there could be an elevator or something, or a satellite phone, I said, looking down into the corridor. What's a satellite phone? Jay asked. It's a phone that doesn't work with cell towers. It connects straight to satellites in orbit. Maybe we can use that to contact somebody on the outside, I explained. Yeah, that's a good idea, Caleb. I think finding proper communication gear is our top priority, not wrecking the place, Sarah said. Agreed, I said, shooting Jay a dirty but playful look. He returned it with a grin, though he still did look like he understood that he had to be careful. We started walking down the halls and soon came to find out the place was basically a maze. There were a bunch of offices, laboratories, and bathrooms, but no phone that worked. No computers that would turn on, nothing. We walked around for about 2 hours probably before we started getting tired. Another 10 minutes after we had agreed that we should stop and get some rest soon, we found it. The stairwell. Jay jumped for joy and Sarah and I awkwardly hugged each other. We found that the door was open and that it didn't require some kind of identification, so we might have had our ticket out of there already. The problem was Ryan and Hurley. It was possible that they ran away and that the creature I saw was just my nerves playing up and my eyes playing tricks on me in a low-light environment. But I could swear that I saw its shadow, its snarl, its sickeningly yellow rotted teeth. I knew it was alive and I could smell it. It smelled like urine and blood with a little bit of crap mixed in. It smelled like it had been down here the whole 40 years that the bunker had been locked down. This thing that I saw, the monster, was probably the reason that nobody came down here and was ever seen again. The reason the government had left it. It was probably what was behind the radio silence that we received from the world. I was sure that the government would know this thing existed. It would lock down the site and dissuade anyone from going within 100 miles. It was the reason we were Split City. My town had been wiped off the maps all that time ago, and it was because there was a monster living under us. I had one question left to answer, which coincidentally opened up so many more for consideration with it. What is this thing? Where did it come from? Was it made, and if so, by who? Are there more of them? I realized that I had been in a sort of trance, stuck in my head as these truths came to me. Jay and Sarah were already looking up, trying to see light at the top of the stairwell. There wasn't any, which meant that we hadn't been down there for nearly as long as it seemed. I checked my phone's clock again and confirmed that it was only 2:15 a.m. We decided that we couldn't wait any longer and started making our way up. By the time that we had gone up about 7 flights, I started thinking out loud. The silence was torture, and I could swear that I heard breathing that wasn't human, so I needed to distract myself or I would have a heart attack. Do you think Ryan and Hurley are okay? I asked the twins. They were silent for a long time as we continued climbing the stairs to freedom. After a few minutes, they replied. I think we have bigger things to worry about, Jay said. I'm not saying that we should just forget about them and go home, but we can't go back down there. Not when the exit is so close, and that thing that you described is still there, assuming that it actually exists. Sarah agreed with her brother. Do you think I'm lying about the monster? I saw it, Sarah. I looked in its beady little eyes and saw it blink. So it couldn't have been a light on the wall or something. And besides that, do you really think that Ryan or Hurley would close the door and lock us inside? I didn't see or hear them, so maybe they got out, I asked. Got. What does that mean? She asked me. You know, the monster got them, it killed them, Jay answered for me. What? Sarah was worked up now. I paused. I could see a door at the very top of the stairwell now that we were closer. I told the twins of my discovery and we started running up the stairs, despite the burning in our legs, and reached the door in about a minute. We stood in front of the door, not daring ourselves to go through it. I sensed the hesitation coming from the twins and I spoke. Are we really going to leave them? I asked. They both looked at each other, seeming to perform a feat of telepathy since they seemed to come to a consensus without talking or my input. No, they said in unison. Why? If we leave Ryan and Hurley down there and they die, then that's on us. Whatever that monster does to them will be our fault. You're really okay with that? I asked them. Yes, Jay replied without a moment to think about it. I looked at him and scoffed. I know you are. You don't have a self-sacrificial bone in your body. I'm talking to you, Sarah. Could you sleep tonight knowing that you left our friends to die? I turned to Sarah, who looked like she wanted to cry. I don't know. I don't know what to, she cried. This is stupid. Let's just go, Jay said, grabbing a hold of Sarah's hand and stepping forward. I put my hand on Jay's shoulder. We made eye contact for a second before I looked away and opened the door. As soon as it opened, cool, fresh air flowed into the small space. It was warmer the higher that we went and the outside air was refreshing. I wanted so badly to go, but I couldn't do it knowing that I would be letting the two boys, be still trapped inside, die. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from below us. We all looked at each other and came to a conclusion that was equally true for every one of us. If we stay, we die. If we don't come to a decision, we'll die. If we leave, we live. They're probably already dead, Caleb. Move on and move it. Jay yelled as he sprinted down the hill with his sister at his side. I conceded. I ran outside and bolted the door shut and booked it down the hill with the twins. There were no pros to staying and all the cons in the world. It was a simple decision to make after we had heard that monster coming up. I knew that it was approaching from the sounds getting slightly louder as it continued. I knew that if we were to stay, I would be dead as soon as I made that choice. After that, we went our separate ways. The twins went home and I made my way home as well. As soon as I was through the door, I received all the calls and messages that I had gotten when I was down there. It was like a robot with a stutter. That was probably what let my parents know that I was home and that the fact that I did and not try to make any movements quieter at all. They rushed at me, my mother hugging me profusely and my father asking where I had been all night. The meetup was canceled and it took me a long time to get home. I didn't get any of your calls because my phone had died. I lied to them. I went to my room after that. I searched the few websites that there were for looking at installations in small towns and I didn't find anything. I also looked for the name of the town, the real name. Split City is just a nickname that we gave the town, after we had all had our other tethers to the world cut. I think the real name was something like Lakeview, named for our multitude of freshwater lakes that were a dream to swim in on our summer afternoon. I didn't find even a single mention on it anywhere. It was as if we didn't exist, and the space that we occupied in Idaho was barren. I didn't see anything about hills serving as entrances to hidden bunkers either. That part was a bit of a stretch, since people saw them mount the dirt all that time ago, so I think it was kind of an open secret as to what they were doing with it. Naturally, Reddit was my next stop. I looked all over this place as well, looking for any sign that we exist, but there wasn't anything. I thought to post here where people believe the strange happenings in the world. People would listen and know never to go to Split City. That all happened in one night, but you don't know the whole story. I've told you half of my experience in that godforsaken bunker because I went back the following day. I was going to find Ryan and find Hurley. hopefully send that thing that lives down there to its maker, and get out as fast as I can. I was standing at the door to the underground bunker again, checking the time. The sun was setting, so I didn't need much confirmation, but it was a habit. I was on the outside, but that was soon going to change. I steeled my nerves and I opened the door. It was like walking into a room where they store frozen meat, except the meat down there is very much alive. I know, I've seen it. I had a metal baseball bat clipped onto my backpack, and it was too cold against the skin on the back of my neck. As I stepped inside, I heard a voice behind me. I recognized it and turned around to see Sarah standing there, hands in her coat and looking at me like I was some sort of psychopath. Considering that I was about to willingly go back into a shut-down underground government office with a monster roaming around inside that might have already eaten my friends, maybe I was. "You're going back down," she said. "Yeah, I can't let Ryan and Hurley be killed because of my inaction. It goes against everything that I am," I clarified. "Well then, that makes two of us," Sarah replied, picking up the backpack that had been lying next to her. "What? No, you can't come back in with me. It has to be me," I told her, but she wasn't stopping. "Why is that?" she asked. "You made your choice, that's why," I yelled. I hadn't meant to, but it just came out. Sarah was stunned. "Jay couldn't have made you leave if you didn't want to. You let him drag you out of that bunker and go home like our friends aren't stuck down there. Maybe they're dead, but I'm not taking that chance. I need to make sure that they aren't hurt. If they are dead, then I'll probably be killed, but if they're alive, I can make sure that they stay that way, and I'm not passing up that opportunity," I rambled. "I understand. I've come to make amends with you, Ryan, and Hurley. I feel horrible about what I did, and I want to correct it if I can. That means going with you, so I'm coming whether you like it or not," Sarah said, locking eyes with me. We were the same age, but her emotional maturity sometimes made me think that she was a few years older. Jay was also very stable, but that was because he had the emotional range of a 2-year-old, and he was disqualified from compliments tonight. The twins, as similar as they were also quite different. More and less mature, and ultimately, I got along better with Sarah. That said, nothing of their interests and hobbies. Simply that Sarah was more agreeable and more likely to come to a compromise instead of arguing the point for hours until we both lost. I clicked my stopwatch to time our adventure and we went in. It was cold, maybe even colder than before, and it only got worse as we went further, deeper into the building, and descending via the stairwell into what was my personal heaven and hell at the same time. It was a beautiful chance to see something similar to the urban legends and creatures that I studied like a religion, but it was also a prime chance to be killed by an amalgam of beings that were simply not supposed to exist in the same body. After about half an hour of walking down the stairs, we came to a stop at sub-level 30, the place where we had been trapped the night before. I opened the door to the office space and saw it exactly as it had been. We made our way, making the exact opposite turns that we had last night, to get back to the door to what I assumed was a decommissioned elevator shaft. We had entered through this elevator shaft last night, and our 2 missing party members had gone missing from the platform outside of sub-level 30, so that was our first stop. We reached the locked door that had split our group, and I was still unable to open it by myself. "Hey, you got any ideas on how to open it?" I asked, looking around for long and thin objects. Sarah got closer to the door and inspected the lock. While she did that, I was walking around trying to spot something that I could pry the door open with, like a slat or something. From the looks of it, this lock is pretty old. If you hit it with your bat, it'll break," Sarah said, stepping away from my target. I rolled my eyes as a thought came to me. "Oh great, Jay's idea was right, I feel cheated," I said, clasping the bat with both hands. I raised it above my head and brought it down hard. I heard the sprinkling of metal on the floor before I could turn my head down to see it. It shattered like glass, the steel having eroded over the 40 years between when it was last used and now. Carefully pushing the door open, I saw that Ryan and Hurley's things were gone. There wasn't a sign that they were ever there, and I thought that maybe they had taken the chance to get out and climbed back up. But there would be crumbs since I knew that Ryan was spilling them all around him while he ate some of the food we brought with us. But there wasn't anything. Someone or something had cleaned it. This caused me to start a small freak-out session on that platform. Was the monster intelligent? Were there still people down here? Did the boys clean it before they left, and are currently hanging out in an ice cream shop, wondering where I'm at? That seemed right, given my luck lately. I showed the scene to Sarah, and she was stumped. I pulled a flashlight from my backpack and shined it around, trying to look for anything that might help when I saw it. The monster, and I had almost missed it. But I saw that it was clinging to the wall in front of me, looking at me with a sly grin, almost like it was expecting me. Shining my light back on it, I saw what it looked like. Before, I had only seen its face, but now I was seeing all of it, and it was absolutely horrifying. It had the head of a man, barely, and the unhinged jaw with yellow-rotted fangs was the same as before. I saw that most of it was normal human biology, only the limbs had been further modified. The thing had scars running along its body. The four most prominent scars ran from the corners of its mouth along its cheeks, and down its neck and the case of the bottom ones. It looked like they were barely staying there, like keeping his jaw on his face was a conscious effort. It had claws sharp enough to cut through steel to allow it to cling to the wall like that. Its hands were far larger than any human could be, and its feet were the same. I guessed that it allowed the creature to move faster and hopefully not hit harder. The rest of it was lanky and pale, as you would expect from a creature that had been locked underground for 4 decades. We made eye contact and I froze. It had the same blue eyes as Ryan. I distinctly remembered that the creature had glowing, powerful yellow eyes, but this thing's eyes had the exact same shade that I had never seen anywhere but in my friends. The thing that used to be Ryan now skittered away, climbing further down the elevator shaft and retreating into the darkness where we couldn't see it. My legs gave out. I dropped to the ground and my hands were shaking. "Ryan, come back," I mumbled, but Sarah heard it just fine. "What? You're not making sense. You need to calm down and breathe, Caleb, breathe," Sarah said, holding my hand still. "I saw it last night and the thing's eyes were yellow. This new one had blue eyes. Ryan's blue eyes," I told her once I had calmed down from my panic attack. "Crap, what do you think it means?" Sarah asked, dumbfounded. "I don't know, maybe this thing is a mimic or something," I offered. "What is that?" she asked again. I sat up and leaned against the wall, pulling my backpack onto my front and rifling through it. It's a creature that, once it kills something, can mimic aspects of a living thing. It might be a few individual parts of that being, or it could simply change its shape into the thing it killed. It could have killed Ryan and Hurley and mimicked some of their traits, like Ryan's eyes. But I didn't see any other differences in it from last night to now. It's skinnier, I guess, but I trailed off. Ryan was practically a twig, Sarah recalled. I didn't like where this was going. "You aren't saying that you think that's Ryan and there are 2 of those monsters running loose in this bunker, are you?" Sarah asked, standing up. "No," I answered. "Good, I would think you're going crazy if you did," she said, chuckling slightly. "I think there's 3, I clarified. Sarah groaned and started walking back to the stairwell. "Well then, I think the best thing we can do in this situation is to leave and never come back," she told me, lingering at the doorway. "I need to know," I said back. She paused. What? I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I thought you said that you want to stay like a crazy person. Sarah called me out. I know it's insane, and I know that you don't want to stay here anymore. I mean, I don't want to either, but I need to know what's happening here. If I don't, it'll eat me alive until I come here again. And I don't want to explain to my parents when I'm caught sneaking out a third time in less than a week. I explained. She seemed conflicted, but I didn't and couldn't know what was going on inside her head. I wasn't some supernatural creature, able to lurk in the dark and invade people's minds. I was me, and I was going to do what I could do to find out what they were so I could end them, finally putting the bunker to rest properly. I voiced that thought, and it got Sarah to resign herself to accompany me on my journey deeper into the bunker. I stood up and we hugged out our frustrations. It was kind of awkward for me to be this close to a girl twice in as many days, but I was able to get over it. When we got to the stairwell, and I knew that the sun had set all the way, and that it was now as dark as it was in here as it was out there. I cracked a glow stick and we started going down the stairwell. We got another 10 levels down before realizing that we still couldn't see the bottom. Sarah and I stopped and discussed our options for sleeping. We could either sleep on the cold hard floor, or we could find a staff room somewhere and use the couches that they could have. I would definitely like a few pillows over laying down on steel or linoleum, so we agreed to find a staff room and camp out in there. Their food wouldn't be good if there even was any, but we were lucky that I brought food. The problem about that was, as we came to find, that I had only packed for me, so we only had enough food for one person to last them a week, if they were practically starving themselves. What we had was enough to last the both of us 3 days if we ate even a few bites of it each day. On sub-level 40, we got the door open and quickly rushed inside. We barricaded the door with a few couches and cabinets. Once we were sure that none of the monsters could break in, we got comfortable. We made sure to make as little noise as possible as we set up our sleeping places. We sat on the ground and I pulled out all the food that we had so that I could properly ration our portions. "What do you want out of this?" I asked, pointing to my Snickers bar, a bag of Skittles, a can of already baked beans, and an apple. Sarah stroked her chin as if she was thinking. I knew that she was disappointed in my planning skills, but she couldn't be more disappointed in me than I was, since now I had to provide for a second person, something that I hadn't even begun to plan for when I was thinking the previous night. "I think I'll be fine with Skittles, Chef," she joked. I laughed, but only to distract myself from the fact that Sarah was going to starve for the time that we were going to be down here. I didn't know how long we would be there, and I was sure that we were going to run out of food before we were done. "Yeah, well, I'll be over here with my Snickers bar, so take that," I said, snatching the bar from the pile. It was probably the second most nutritious thing in the room, after the beans. We sat like that, me eating the Snickers bar and Sarah eating half the bag of Skittles until we were ready for sleep to come. I think she hoped that she would wake up at home with this whole adventure having been a really bad dream. It wasn't a dream though, it was a nightmare. Sarah woke up with a start at about 11 o'clock. She was sweating and it was likely that she had a nightmare, but I found it hard to believe her mind could supply something worse than this. I guess that she could have been simply reliving her own memories, but that only happens in movies and stuff. After a while, I noticed that Sarah wasn't going back to sleep, so I decided to try and help, however awkward it was going to be. I sat up, which startled her, which I immediately apologized for. "Do you want to talk about what you dreamed?" I asked, leaning forward. "Yeah, I had the worst nightmare. I imagined that we hadn't found a place to sleep and that we had gotten found by those monsters, except there were so many of them. There were easily 20 of them. When I looked up, I saw that Jay had come with us. He was ripped apart and then I watched you get torn to shreds, Sarah told me. I was horrified to say the least. I felt some adrenaline work its way through me and fade as quickly as it came. I pictured myself actually trying to fight those things and being ripped apart, limb by limb until I was a bloody stump. Watching them eat my legs until I died of blood loss or shock, whichever came first. I'm sorry that you had to see that, even if it was just a bad dream. I promise that will never happen. Jay isn't even here, so it can't happen like that, I said. It wasn't scary because I care about Jay. It was scary because I care about you too. You're kind of my best friend right now, she shot back. What do you mean? We've only been talking because of your brother. If Jay and I weren't friends, then we wouldn't be friends either, I told her, slumping down into my makeshift bed. That isn't true. You're awesome and you risked your life to help your friends. I mean, they're dead now and mutated into some weird chimera, but that was still cool for you to even think about. Nobody I know would have done this purely out of selflessness except you. That's incredible, and I think you're definitely friend material, she reassured me. You think all that. I'm just a guy, I said. Well, let's agree to disagree. You think you're a greasy nerd, and I think you're a hero, Sarah plainly stated. Whoa, 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 whoa. I never said the words greasy or nerd, I argued. I regretted talking so loud after an extremely loud screech came from right outside the door. It made Sarah cover her ears and it sounded as if it was inside our heads. The door shook and with it, the massive barricade that we had made. It didn't look like we were going to be getting any more sleep. Sarah packed up all of her things and I looked around for a weapon. I saw a few things that I could use to impale the thing with. A pool stick, a few regular kitchen knives, and I still had my baseball bat. So that was more than a few weapons that were immediately available to me. The door was ripped off the hinges and tossed aside, which was impressive since it was all steel. Heavily aged and probably rusty steel, but it was more than a human could do, so I was still scared out of my mind. I saw that it was a different monster than the others because of the creature's piercing green eyes. It was also a couple of shades darker than the others, which made me believe that it was younger and had less time to settle into its new form and fade from the tan color that Hurley's skin was to the absolute white that the other two had. It was also a bit thicker than the others, which fit Hurley to a T. I watched as this new monster ripped our barricade down in one try, utterly crushing whatever confidence that I had in myself. The creature was in the room, but I had hidden Sarah in a bathroom in the back, so she was safe as long as she stayed quiet. It lunged at me, but with a bat in my hand, I swung. I landed that swing on the thing's head and it sprawled on the ground for a moment, trying to regain its bearings. Using the distraction, I ran to the knives and picked up two, keeping my body facing the monster and sheathing one for later use. The creature jumped at me and I attacked. I jabbed at the monster with my knife, but the blade broke in half, which also twisted my wrist at an angle that it was probably sprained. I dropped the handle and clutched my wrist. Well, that was a bust, I muttered. The blade hadn't affected the creature at all. It was like it was iron or steel and not the crappy old military base variety, but the good stuff. I simply couldn't hurt the thing. The monster knew this and got ready for the kill shot. The monster stood tall and opened its mouth. And when I say opened its mouth, I mean that the thing's jaw unhinged, and the scars on its face, the same as the creature that once was Ryan, opened and unfurled to let me see the true horror of it. And I came up with the perfect name for the creature that I could put in my bestiary for paranormal entities: the Splitters. These monsters could unhinge their jaws and opened up their mouths and throats to allow them to swallow a human whole. They were big enough to do the deed, and it was likely that their bodily fluids were corrosive, allowing for a smoother meal. They could apparently transform humans into another version of them, though how they did was unknown to me at the time. While it had its face open, I got distracted and impulsively poked, these splitters exposed flesh with my baseball bat. The splitter jerked back and seemed to be in pain from the shivering that racked its body. I realized the splitter's weakness. Their skin was pretty much indestructible, but if you could bypass the outer shell and get straight to the flesh inside, then they were fragile. I guess that the creature had adapted to be resistant to attacks, but it was never attacked from the insides, with things like poison or a bomb implanted in their brain, something like that. The splitter's jaw unhinged itself again and it roared at me. I had never heard a sound like that in my life. It sounded like it could have been words, but it was in a language that I couldn't understand. And like multiple people were talking at once, it was very disorienting. That allowed the splitter to pounce. It tackled me and we both fell to the ground. The splitter was drooling on my face. I guess it was time to test out that corrosive bodily fluids theory of mine. It stung badly. The stinging was unbearable and I screamed bloody murder as I slid myself out from under the splitter and let it fall to the ground. I could feel my skin peeling away as I pulled out the knife and stalked toward the splitter with what I could only guess is an aura of murderous intent. I felt the corrosion subside as I finally managed to get a good hit on the splitter, sinking my knife upwards into its brain from the inside of its own mouth. It felt great to know that I had killed such a powerful creature, but my hand was also burning even more than my face, which was already screwed. I screamed, victorious, and I passed out. I don't know how long I was passed out for, but when I woke up, my injuries were healed. My wrist was a bit stiff, but I figured that it would work itself out with time. I was more worried about my face and my other arm though. I had been drenched in the corrosive saliva of the splitter that was still sprawled across the floor where I had killed it. Sarah, who had been tending to my wounds judging by the basic first aid kit on my side, noticed that I was awake. She started to fret over me. "Don't move, you'll mess with your dressings," she said. "You know first aid?" I asked. The worst of the damage was above my nose and I could feel the differences in how the fabric felt on the undamaged skin and the scar tissue. Very basic first aid, but yeah. I had to make sure that the splitter was dead before I started treating you, so that was fun, Sarah complained. "You're calling it a splitter as well?" I asked, confused as to how she knew of the conclusions that I had come to. "You talk in your sleep," she said, failing to hide a smirk. "Oh," I said, the flush that came over my face aggravating my burns. Sarah proceeded to show me my arm. It was horribly scarred, but it was better than I had imagined. I had a lot of mobility, though closing my fist still hurt a lot. She wouldn't let me see my face. I think it hadn't written out the recommended time the kid said to leave my bandages on. I was able to get set up and move around, and I quickly saw to it that the splitter was tossed down the hole in the stairwell, falling until it had reached the bottom, probably tearing the body into pieces in a gruesome display. I didn't know because I couldn't actually see the bottom, despite my eyes being uncovered. I hadn't suffered too much from loss of vision. Only certain spots in my field of vision were spotty or blurry. We were able to hear the splitter's body impact the ground in about 10 seconds, however, which meant we were close to the bottom even if we couldn't see it. I felt good about that because we had almost no food for what was supposed to be a simple in-and-out mission for one person. When we packed up our things, faith restored that this adventure was actually possible to complete, not that we had any in the first place. Sarah took most of the weight since I was still recovering, and we set off down the stairwell and kept going until we couldn't anymore. My phone's clock said that it was 10:30 a.m. and that I had guessed that we had gotten about 3 hours of good sleep before the splitter showed up. I had gotten a few more hours in because of blacking out, but Sarah looked ready to drop after 20 flights of stairs. "Are you okay? We can go back if you want," I said. "No, we need to get to the bottom of this, literally," she countered. Yeah, but we could always use a different staff room again and you can get some actual sleep, I offered. No, that isn't fair to you. I can keep going, so don't worry about it, Sarah said before trailing off and leaning forward. She was falling. Crap. We were on the flat, concrete between flights, and she was going to fall onto the stairs and be seriously hurt if I didn't do something. I rushed forward, ignoring my burning legs, and got in front of Sarah, just as her legs gave out. I caught her, but she was unconscious, so I was going to have to carry her down a couple more flights. I managed to get to the door of sub-level 57. I barricaded the door again, this time with stronger materials, and I actually fixed them to each other and helped Sarah get to sleep on the couch in that floor staff room. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up lying next to Sarah. It was strange because I was on the floor curled up in a blanket, while she was supposed to be on the couch with a bunch of pillows and stuff. Naturally, I was uncomfortable. Sarah and I did have a history. We've known each other for a long time thanks to Jay. He and I met as toddlers and he finally made me talk to her when I was 10. I had always wanted to talk to her, but Jay saw that one of those stupid childhood crushes was blooming, so he shut it down quickly. After that, I just quietly pined after Sarah for a few years, until she snuck away from Jay and told me that she had felt the same things that I was feeling for her. It blew my mind that somebody could be that interested in me, and so I asked her out on a date. This was when we were 14, so the only place that I could take a girl to was the roller skate rink at the edge of town. She didn't show up. I talked to her the next day and she said that it had been a prank from the other girls, but that she was forced into it. I forgave her but ended up correctly guessing that that group of girls was becoming a major pain in the butt for everyone, so I asked her to stop talking to them. Sarah agreed and started hanging out with her brother and I full time, but it was still weird between us. My affection for her had withered slightly, but I still respected her. She never acknowledged our little incident again, and so I didn't either. Jay didn't seem to know anything that happened, so we simply went on about our lives. That was about 2 years ago, though, and I was over that. I never thought to ask if she really did have those feelings, but it was irrelevant. She hurt me, and that was all that mattered, and even if that had been put to rest. I snapped out of it as Sarah started to wake up. She rolled over to come face to face with me. "Holy crap," she said and scrambled out of our position. Yeah, that's what I thought. I didn't want to wake you, so I just kind of froze up and tried to go back to sleep, I said. "Yeah, right, you liked it," she teased. I can like something and want it to stop. It's called overstimulation, I told her. "Okay, that's just gross. It was nothing like that," Sarah groaned. "What was it like then?" I asked. She turned red and it was adorable. That's what I would say if I still liked her, which I didn't, not one bit. "I must have moved in my sleep," she almost yelled, and I had to shush her, getting her to mutter sorry. "I didn't know you sleepwalk," I said. She was silent for a long time. "Listen, we can talk about this stuff when we get out of here," I told her, and she gave me a thankful look. "You mean if?" she asked. "No, I mean when. We are leaving. You are going to live even if it kills me. We're almost to the bottom, I know it," I clarified. "Thanks, but you shouldn't think like that. We're both going home, do you understand?" she said, and I nodded. A few moments passed until Sarah asked the golden question that was probably setting a few alarms in her brain off. "How do you know we're almost at the bottom?" she asked. "When you passed out, I managed to carry you down a level. Just as I was about to go inside, I saw the lights at the end. It's only about 10 levels down, so we can get there by 1:30 p.m., I explained. "You carried me?" she asked. Her blush came back full force and I couldn't help the smile that overcame my face as she curled in on herself in embarrassment. Yep, I had to. I couldn't drag you down the stairs, I said. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's get going. Sarah changed the subject. I could tell that she was uncomfortable with being questioned, so I let it go. We packed up and hit the stairs, and we made it a couple of flights down before the other question that I was expecting came up. What time is it? Sarah asked. It's currently 12:37 p.m., I answered. What? That's insane, that means that. She trailed off. We've been down here for almost 19 hours. Yeah, I confirmed. That's crazy, they probably noticed that we're gone. Sarah said, and I agreed. Both of us disappear together, that'll paint some pictures. I said as I accidentally missed a step and stumbled a bit. I regained control of myself, but it was still embarrassing. Another 20 minutes in, we were there. We stood in front of the door looking at the blinking light above it that said, "Authorized personnel only." We looked at each other and snickered as we pushed the door open easily. Had top-notch security, I said sarcastically. Hey, this was 40 years ago. Plus, there's Splitter running about down here. Sarah defended it. I can't believe this, I said in amazement, which Sarah took for an exaggerated offense taken to her opposition. Well, that's whack, she said as she realized what I was seeing. We were looking at a massive room with pods full of ice. They had people in them, but they were dead and I could tell from the smell. That and the fact that the pods were open. A man was standing in front of two of the cleaner looking pods, examining two bodies, the bodies of Ryan and Hurley. Hey you, who are you and what are you doing with our friends? I said as we ran closer to the man. He tried to run, but I caught him easily. He was older, so I outpaced him without much effort. I unclipped my baseball bat from my backpack and pointed it at him, while Sarah unsheathed the knife that she had brought with her when we left the first staff room. Answer me now, I yelled. Shh, you'll attract them, the old man said and began walking. Come, he told us. We found ourselves obeying him for whatever reason. He led us to a room that, once the doors closed, was completely soundproof. We could be however loud we wanted, and we took advantage of that. Do you have any weapons on you? I asked. No, he answered. Do you have any weapons hidden in this office? Sarah asked. Yes, he answered. Why? We asked simultaneously. To kill the monsters that you have so affectionately called the Splitters, he told us. You've been watching us, I asked. I recalled a few cameras placed throughout the facility, but I hadn't thought that they would still be active. I didn't even think that there was anybody alive down here, and I said as much. The old man chuckled at my question of how the heck he was still alive. If you store it right, a large enough number of canned goods can last you a century. I'm the only one left who hasn't been turned into one of those things and subsequently died, he said. How did they die? I asked. Starvation, the old man answered. The man sighed and put on a presentation, likely on that he had not shown in a long time. So long that he almost looked giddy. The presentation started and the old man started talking. He introduced himself as Dr. Collar. Caleb, I said. Sarah, she followed. Okay then, Caleb, Sarah. How long have you two been in this facility? Collar asked. 19 hours and then some, I answered. We were here last night too. We were only a few hours that time and we didn't go this deep. Only to sub-level 30, was it? Sarah chimed in. Yeah, level 30, I confirmed. That's astonishing. You've survived for almost an entire day outside the lab with nothing but yourselves. Nobody else made it that far. Callar praised. I have a few questions about that. If you saw us, why didn't you try to help us? I asked. I couldn't contact you without revealing your location to the splitters, Keller answered. It was good enough for me, but it had some holes. Why not? Sarah apparently didn't feel the same way. The creatures can sense emissions in the electromagnetic spectrum. That includes radio waves, Keller explained. That satisfied us both, but a few burning questions came up after that. Why can they sense electromagnetic waves? Do they have some sort of organ that humans don't or something? Sarah said jokingly. Spot on. They evolved to be able to know when the guards with radios were coming. They ambushed the guards and killed them. That's how this place became the way that it is now, Keller said. That makes no sense. Evolution is the steady progression of a species over hundreds of thousands of years. It took us millennia to simply walk upright. Do you think we believe these things would develop a whole new organ in a few years? I ranted. Yes, these things adapt at an unprecedented level. You experienced the splitters' hardened skin and acidic saliva yourself, I can see it. Those features are new to this specific breed. I didn't expect them to be as powerful as they were when they escaped, Keller muttered. Escaped? Sarah asked. Keller was silent for a few moments until they decided to tell the whole story of the splitters and what this installation was really for. After an hour, he could tell that we were getting tired. You kids should get to bed. I have actual beds in the back. I'm sure you would like to sleep and shower, Keller said. We both lit up like Christmas trees. We thanked him for his hospitality and we got settled into bed nicely, clean and happy. I used this opportunity to relay the story of the splitters. 100 years ago, the government came across one and decided to dissect it and saw how it worked. The creature was extremely strong, fast, and durable, and it became even more so after time. When the government decided to test an adaptation theory of theirs, they introduced snake DNA into the splitter's body. It integrated perfectly and the monster became able to unhinge its jaw and eat people whole. It also shed its skin every so often as it grew. Next, these scientists introduced spider DNA. It grew fangs that injected a paralyzing agent into the victim. It became even deadlier. In the 1970s, they built this laboratory to farm the creature as they found that splitter DNA also merged harmlessly with human DNA. They proceeded to conduct experiments on humans and these splitter hybrids that they had made. Soon they had the splitters that we had encountered on our journey. These splinters were able to plant their DNA to humans and that human would slowly transform into a splitter over a day. It was very fast acting and there wasn't a cure. After a few years, they stopped getting volunteers for their experiments, as it came out that they weren't telling people that it was getting split that they were signing up for. They started taking people, kidnapping people on the streets and bringing them down into the bunker and putting these splitter DNA into themselves. They made too much, however, and the hybrids revolted. They destroyed the facility and slaughtered everyone inside. It was mainly on the bottom few layers and they soon infested the place. But they starved to death in a few weeks, a side effect of still being human, if only on a basic level. That was 40 years ago, though. Recently, Kalar had been receiving people from the outside and being forced to experiment on them. The government seemingly having a renewed interest in the high breeding project. I got the feeling that I wasn't being told everything, but I finally knew what these splitters were and I was ready to go home when we woke up. We had slept for about 12 hours, which was understandable since we had been through a lot of extremely exhausting things in the last couple of days. I checked my watch where I had clicked on a stopwatch when I first went down all that time ago. It was at a little over 47 hours. It was hard to believe that we had been down there for almost 2 entire days. But when you're inside for long enough, time gets muddy. I was pulled aside by Sarah, who looked very uncomfortable. We went to a back room for privacy. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "Okay, what?" I asked. "I need some feminine hygiene products." Her smile was forced, and I could tell that she would rather not be talking about this. Okay. I'll look around in the locker area. I saw it when we were about to sleep before. There's probably some very old but usable stuff in there," I said, and set off for the room that I was talking about. When I got there, I found that the rooms were separated by gender, which was perfect. I didn't need to spend time searching around for female names, and I could just head straight for the women's sections. Kyler was nowhere to be found. I thought that he would stop me, but I was able to rummage around easily and find a few different things that I thought could help. I didn't know much about this stuff, but my parents had always made sure that I understood the things my school taught me in sex ed, about both the male and female anatomy. They were awesome. I realized while walking back that I was sure that I would die while down there before we had found Kalar. What would my parents think? What would Sarah's parents think, or Jay? My parents would probably think that Sarah had led me down here, and Sarah's would think that I did that to her. It would be a whole mess if we never came back one day. It probably was a mess up there. We had been gone for a day and a half already, and my parents weren't those kinds of hippie people. They were borderline helicopter parents. I made my way back and I saw Ryan and Hurley in the cryo chamber through the window, and a question from before came into my mind. If Ryan and Hurley were turned into monsters, then how are they there, alive and well, according to the EKG machines at the pod's side? Crap. I suddenly recalled how Jay said he got the idea to come down here in the first place. He said that he had heard 2 older men talk about the bunker and how dangerous it is, and that anybody who went in and survived would be a hero in his book. Kalar said that he had been getting sent people to experiment on, and I had been sickened at the time, but now I understood a fact that I had brushed off earlier. He had known that we were there the whole time and was expecting people, preferably healthy young individuals, to get the best results. We were sent to him on purpose so that we could get turned into splitters. I stuffed the products into my backpack and ran to where I had left Sarah. When I got there, she wasn't in the storage room anymore. I heard a scream suddenly and chased after it. It was a girl screaming. So unless Kalar had people in here that he didn't tell anybody about, though, then it was Sarah. I busted the door down and rushed into the room where the screams were coming from. Sarah was strapped onto an operating table by leather restraints. She was straining against them, but she simply couldn't break them. Kalar was in a surgeon's outfit and was readying surgical equipment: scalpels, petri dishes, and tweezers. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled. "I thought I locked that door," Kalar muttered. "The locks here are all rusted," I said as I walked toward him, baseball bat in hand. "Hey, don't do anything you regret, Caleb." "We did that when we walked into this place. You've been waiting for us. I bet the phones here really do work. It's just that you shut them all down so that you could control who communicates with who on the outside," I accused. "Well, you're a smart cookie. You and the girl are my perfect donors," Kalar revealed. "What?" I asked. Sarah was still struggling to get out of her restraints, and I shot her a look that said, "Not yet." She understood and stopped trying to get out as vehemently. She couldn't simply stop trying to escape, otherwise Kyler would catch on. She needed to look like she was struggling but losing the will to fight. "I'm supposed to extract her sex cells, combine them with yours, and grow the fetus, injecting small amounts of splitter DNA along the way," Kyler explained. I was speechless. I looked at Sarah and she was trying harder than ever to get out of her bindings and leave. I smashed the buckle that held the restraints on her left arm. allowing her to undo the bindings on her right arm herself. Once she had undone the binds on her legs, we both stood at the door. "You're sick. What, you think introducing splitter DNA will make it a smoother transformation?" Sarah asked. "Yes and no. There will be no need for a transformation. The fusion will be born with its splitter traits already manifested. It'll be the ultimate form of humankind. It will be able to take in what makes it stronger and expel the weak from society. It will be the chameleon," Keller said. While Keller was going on and on about his perfect creation, I swung at him and caved his head in. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't something that I'm proud of, but I did it. It looked like the skin of a grape with his brains splattered all over the floor behind him. His corpse sprawled across the floor at strange angles. "Holy crap," Sarah screamed. I turned to look at her and she was looking at me like I was crazy. But if I allowed him to keep going, he would probably win against me. My hand was throbbing as the blood rushed under my burns. "Come on, we're leaving," I shouted, and we rushed to our temporary room. We grabbed our things and set off. Sarah and I sprinted to the soundproofed room that he had told us the splitter's origins in. We were about to make for the door when I saw a flashing set of numbers in my peripheral vision. I stopped and looked at them properly. They weren't just numbers, it was a countdown. It also said, "Time until detonation" on it, so I got the message. "Sarah, stop. This place is gonna blow in 2 minutes. There's no hope for us to get to the surface in time," I said, shrinking in on myself. I sat down, accepting defeat. Apparently Sarah wasn't having any of that and she kicked me for being stupid. "Do you think that we should just sit down and die? Heck no. We've been up against the odds this whole time and we're still alive. Do you know how crazy that is? I think we should at least try, don't you?" Sarah said. I felt a surge of something. Was it admiration, respect? I thought that it might have been my old crush for a second, but I pushed that down and stood up. "Yeah, how are we going to get out though?" I asked. Sarah looked around for things that could help, and I thought back to our travels around the facility. What could have been useful to us now? I thought for a few moments until I remembered an idea that I had about the entrance that our group had used during our first journey into the bunker being an unused elevator shaft. I voiced that thought and got a look of pure amazement from Sarah. We sprinted all the way to where we approximated the shaft's bottom entrance was. We found it in about 30 seconds, meaning that we still had 1 minute left. We got in and the doors closed. "What floor would you like to go to?" An artificial voice asked me. I was too nervous to nerd out about how cool it was that the government had invented that kind of technology, when it was only now becoming even a little bit commonplace. Take us to the very top," I yelled. The elevator complied and started taking us up slower than I would have liked, but it was getting the job done. By my guess, we had about 40 seconds until the whole facility went up in flames. "Can you take us any faster?" Sarah was hyperventilating. I put my hands on her shoulder. "Breathe, Sarah, breathe," I told her. Sarah started doing small breathing exercises in the corner while I examined the control board for the elevator. "What speed setting would you like to move at?" the voice asked, its calm tone actually bringing me down a bit and helping me focus. "The fastest setting," I shouted, and it was like the whole world tried to come and punch me in the face. The speed of the elevator rapidly shifted, and the difference in the speed was so great that I was pulled down, my legs not being strong enough to keep up under that kind of stress. I fell to the floor in an instant, and so did Sarah. I crawled over to her and told her to hold on as I knew what was coming next. I was sure that the elevator wouldn't be able to stop itself when it got to the top, and I couldn't see the writing on the walls that indicated what levels we're on as they all blurred past. And that was when I realized that it was going to be worse than I thought. It was only a few moments until I felt the resistance of the ceiling of the shaft give out, and we went flying through the air as I heard the countdown sound from inside the facility. I also heard the splitters climbing the walls of the shaft, so we were pretty much dead if the blast didn't kill them. Our elevator landed on the ground with a loud crash and I heard screams. They were distinctly human sounds, so I climbed out of the elevator, helping Sarah out after me, and I ran towards them. I saw both our families standing next to the blown out hatch that led to the elevator shaft. We started running toward each other, but I was still concerned about these splitters and the incoming explosions. "Everybody, get back, it's gonna..." I didn't get to finish my sentence as flame erupted from the hole in the ground and everybody was pushed back. My vision was fuzzy for a second. It was always just a bit fuzzy from when I had accidentally been drenched in a splitter's fluids. I knew that I would have vision problems for life and my hand would probably always be weaker than the undamaged one. I hadn't seen my face yet, but I was sure there was a long scar running across it from my left temple to the bottom right of my jaw, spanning the width of a couple inches. But then the splitters came. They were sooty and black and smelled like roasted chicken, but they were alive and that was bad for everyone. I quickly rushed to the one person that I didn't recognize, a police officer. I grabbed his gun and aimed it at the creature. "Whoa, kid," he yelled, but I didn't care, because those things needed to die that very second. I wasn't going to let them kill us now after everything Sarah and I had been through. I shot at the splitter that used to be Ryan and it roared at me with its exposed maw. I shot it twice in the pink muscle and brain tissue that I knew was just above the roof of its mouth. The thin splitter dropped dead. I couldn't stop now though. My scarred hand was starting to throb from the firing of the gun, but I pushed through that pain and kept attacking the bigger, stronger splitter, the original. I didn't know who this thing had originated from, but it didn't matter anymore. That person was dead, and all that mattered was that this thing joined him preferably soon. I kept aggressing, firing 3 times at it to get it to expose itself, but it seemingly knew about its own inferiorities and kept its jaw shut the whole time. This was the last resort, but I unclipped my baseball bat from my backpack. It had scorch marks on it, which made me wonder how powerful that explosion was really supposed to be. I'm sure the chemicals had to be old, but I wasn't sure how all of that worked in the first place. I ran at the splitter with my bat in hand and leaped with my swing. My bat and I came down at the same moment, giving my blow extra power. The splitter got angry and yelled something at me in some language that I think it invented while it was kept prisoner by the government all that time ago. Now was my chance. I jammed the gun into the thing's mouth and pulled the trigger, watching as it fell to the ground in a heap. I grinned, but felt that hand of unconsciousness over me like I had the first time that I had defeated a splitter. I passed out again. I woke up in a hospital and I was fully healed. It was supposedly the next day, but I was allowed to see my scars. I was right about my face, spot on in fact. I had already seen my hand and I wasn't surprised to hear that I had sustained hairline fractures along my forearm from my already injured hand firing the gun in rapid succession. Nobody would believe us when we had talked about the splitters. Our families did, of course, though it didn't count because they had seen them with their own eyes as well. So naturally, I'm keeping my promise of the whole story and posting about this. I hope you believe me. I've written this whole thing out as a reminder for people to never blindly trust what you've been told. After all, my town held monsters and nobody knew. You never know what your town could hold, do you? 3 months ago, my wife and I were on our way to visit my mother-in-law, living alone far up in the White Mountains. I had been driving for 5 hours and my wife Betty started saying that she needed to use the bathroom and that she was really hungry. My full bladder agreed with her on the first issue, though I also tried to make good time and get there before nightfall, when the street signs would become harder to read. I had never been to Betty's mother's house before, or even the county that it lay in. I pulled over the car on the east side of Main Street, looking down the center of the town. It had everything a small rural American town usually had. Quaint houses with blue siding, 24-hour diners, hardware stores and tobacco shops, liquor stores and restaurants. Majestic mountains rose all around us and the town itself was so high that I could see for miles. The air smelled clean and sweet. Everything was here except no people, my wife said, as if reading my mind. I looked over at her, frowning. Yeah, this is bizarre, I said. This place looks like it was hit by the Black Death. Where is everyone? My wife unlocked her door and got out, pulling a cigarette from her purse and lighting it. She gave the pack to me and I took one. My wife looked pale and thin under the late afternoon sun, her black hair and dark eyes contrasting heavily with her light Irish skin. Lately, she seemed to have lost weight, but she wouldn't talk about it. Every time I asked her if anything was wrong, she had said no, and I could get no more response from her than that. The fragrant Turkish tobacco of the Camel cigarette instantly woke me up. We didn't smoke in the car as it was brand new and it cost me over $25,000 that I didn't really have. The last thing that I wanted was burn marks on the seats and ashes flying everywhere. We walked slowly down the sidewalk, looking around, searching for the slightest signs of movement. I didn't even see an animal except for an occasional fly buzzing past on its way to eat garbage. I looked into the diner window, and I saw plates set out on the tables. Mold grew wild on the food, strange patches of green and red and black sprouting filaments and making the dishes unrecognizable. Next to the plates, I saw cell phones and even car and house keys. All the screens on the phones looked black, as if they had been sitting there for months. A slight layer of grime and dust had settled over everything. The doors stood wide open, a cheerful sign reading, "We're open, come in," displayed on the front. That's gotta be a code violation, I said, pointing inside at the disgusting plates of mold and fungus. My wife laughed, but it sounded nervous and high-pitched, almost desperate in its cadence. Listen, Betty, do you think we should maybe call the police or something? She looked at me for a long moment and then sighed. I mean, I don't know, she said. What crime has been committed? It's just an empty town. Maybe everybody is at a funeral. Her voice raised hopefully. I laughed. What, they just abandoned their shops and restaurants with no workers and moldering food? And by the way, there's a cop car right there, I said, pointing. It sat on 4 flat tires covered in a thick coat of dust. The tires didn't look damaged in any way. It seems they had just lost pressure over time without anybody to care for them. Looking around at the other cars, I saw most were not in much better shape. Many of them had low or no air in their tires, and their windshields were covered in dirt and grime. It looked like a junkyard in the middle of a town. A junkyard that had been abandoned. I'm calling the cops, I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the screen and of course found that I had no service. I tried sending a text to my mother explaining the situation and telling her to call the authorities if she received it and to send help immediately. I gave her the name of the town and the time. I figured the chances of a text going through were far better than a phone call, since a brief moment of service could prove sufficient to transfer the message. Yeah, I'm not calling the cops, I shook my head. We don't have a shred of service out here. What kind of town doesn't have service on its own main street? We are in the middle of the mountains, Betty said. Who the heck knows out here? We kept walking down the street in silence. Betty went inside a few of the shops and tried flicking on the lights or looking for a phone. The electricity was apparently as dead as the town itself. I occasionally checked my phone, finding nothing had changed. As we walked further along, I started to give up hope that help would be coming from outside. I finished my cigarette and Betty lit another one and gave me the pack again. I sighed and took another Camel out of the pack, lighting it and inhaling deeply. It gave me something to do at least, and it helped take my mind off the strangeness of this town. And then we came up to the police station, and I choked on the smoke as I saw what lay there before us. At first, I thought that some vandal had used the red spray paint to put up a bizarre slogan across the front of the station. But then I saw all the flies, and I smelled the copper and iron, and I realized it likely wasn't paint at all. We follow the black sun, it said in huge letters, each of them nearly 6 feet tall and thickly painted across the windows and walls. My wife squinted at it, tilting her head in a girlish way, her black hair falling across her face. She took a long, thin hand and pushed it aside. The Black Sun, she said. Is that a metal band? It sounds like those Norwegian Satanists that you like to listen to. What's the name? Burzum and Darkthrone and stuff. She started walking forwards, trying to inspect the letters more closely. I put my hand on her shoulder, and I pulled her back with a little more force than I had intended. She stumbled and gave me a dirty look. Johnny, be careful. You almost made me fall. Sorry, I said, my heart pounding in my chest. But don't get too close to that. I'm fairly sure that's blood, and it might be a crime scene. You don't want to touch it or trample the area if it is. She looked at me shocked and then glanced back at the letters, seeing the flies swarming around the coagulated sticky mess. Animal blood? She asked helpfully. Yeah, sure, I guess, I said non-committedly. Okay, let's get back to the car and get the heck out of here. I think I've seen enough. We need to get the cops here. Whatever's going on, it's way beyond anything that we can deal with. I turned around quickly and taking my wife's hand. She pulled away. Oh, don't start getting all worked up, she said. We haven't seen any indication of anything crazy, not yet. All we know is the people are somewhere not here, and that somebody vandalized the police station. I want to keep exploring. I looked at her amazed. She pointed past me at an old-looking church built of stone, probably from the 1800s. It stood near the end of the small downtown area next to thick clusters of evergreen trees. It had a plaque outside that I couldn't make out. The doors stood wide open and the darkness inside seemed to beckon. For a moment, I almost agreed with Betty. I almost said that I too wanted to go inside that church. I think it was what the French call l'appel du vide, or the call of the void. That urge to suddenly jump when standing at the edge of a cliff, or to see if a car can go 130 miles an hour on the highway when it's snowing. Then I shook my head quickly, as if awakening from a short dream. I looked back at Betty and laughed. There was no humor in it, however. You must be crazy, I said. I want to get out of here now. There's nothing to explore, everyone's gone, and if we keep going deeper into this, I have a feeling that we'll run into something far worse than anything we've yet seen. Okay, how about this? She said, making a thoughtful face and putting her finger up to her chin. Why don't you see if the cop car is unlocked? Jump it with our car and use whatever they have in it to call for help. They probably have a walkie-talkie or something connected to the state police station. If you really think we need a SWAT team here, then that's probably the quickest way. No, let's just leave, I said, walking quickly back in the direction of our car. I saw the new Chevy Trailblazer off in the distance, contrasting heavily with the dirty and abandoned cars surrounding it. And then as we got close, I saw that it had 4 flat tires. I started running forwards, seeing the deep knife marks slicing open each of the side walls. What in the... I said, stopping in my tracks. I looked around the town but still saw no trace of anyone. Why? Why would someone do this? To stop us from leaving, obviously, my wife said, sounding unperturbed. Look, we might be here for a while, so I'm going into that package store and grabbing a few things. Maybe some wine, maybe some cigarettes, because somebody smoked most of mine. She narrowed her eyes at me playfully. Do you even realize what's happening right now? I asked, my voice rising unconsciously in anger and frustration. No, do you? She said. This isn't a joke, I said, feeling hot and anxious. We're trapped here and there's letters written in blood, and now somebody slashed our tires. Do you still think that we don't need the police? She smiled at me. You always worry too much, she said. Just calm down for once. Don't have an anxiety attack on me. There's no cell phone service to call for help if you do, remember? That jogged something in my memory and I looked questioningly at her. Do you have any weapons on you? I asked. I have. I reached into my pockets, frowning. I pulled out a small Swiss Army knife. Its red surface looked dull from age, and even I thought it looked small and pathetic in my hand. This, she laughed. What are you going to do with that? Kill a chipmunk? She asked. I mean, I think you can cut your nails with it too, if you want to use a dull, crappy pair of scissors that barely cut paper. She laughed at her own joke, then stopped when she saw the anger and fear on my face. Betty looked at me with a strange expression. It was hard to perturb her. She had always been different from me. When I was stressed about money or work or anything else, she would laugh it off and say that I was too serious. But this seemed to be stretching the boundaries. I felt in my heart that we were in danger and she didn't seem to notice. Look, she continued, sighing. Let's go get some cigarettes and drinks and stuff. Then maybe we can take the car over to the police cruiser and jump it. Then we can call the cops and AAA too, and just sit here and wait for the cavalry to arrive. This is a brand new car, I yelled. I'm not driving it on the rims over there. That's gonna destroy the rotors and could damage some other stuff. I didn't actually know anything about cars and she knew it. No, I think it'll be fine, she said, smiling. But I wouldn't get my... Her words were cut off by a siren that had started up suddenly, deafening and shrill. It seemed to vibrate the air itself, and the dead town came to life in a cacophony of noise and vibration. I saw my wife's lips moving as she tried to scream something, but I had no idea what it was. I covered my ears with my hands, which barely helped, and then after about 10 seconds it stopped. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine like I had just walked into a flashbang. It went away slowly and Betty's voice came back to me, rising from nothingness in a crescendo until I could make out her cadence and speech again. Into the siren, she said, her face unusually serious and drawn. The sun had started to go down behind the mountains now, sending long shadows streaking across the road. Soon it would be dark and we would likely be trapped here for the entire night, or longer. Hiking out of here was an option, and the highway was only about 5 miles away. These thoughts passed through my mind as I saw shadows fall over Betty, before I realized that I had no idea what she said. What? I yelled. I said, we should go towards the siren. They have electricity. They probably have a landline and maybe there's people there, she said, still speaking far too loudly. I guessed her ears were ringing as well. "Okay, you don't have to yell," I said. "I can hear you and I don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention." She pointed at these sliced tires of my car. "We already have, Johnny," she said seriously. "Listen, I don't like this," I said. "I don't want to be trapped in some nutjob's basement a few hours from now, chained up against a wall and covered in blood, and think back on how I should have done something different. I think the safest plan is to leave this place now. I mean right now. Let's grab some drinks and cigarettes and whatever from the store, and hike back out towards the highway on the main route. Maybe we'll see somebody on the walk, but we'll definitely find help on the highway." She thought about it for a fraction of a second and then nodded. "Okay, whatever," she said. "Let's go." The plan worked at first. Betty ran into the package store while I kept watch outside, looking up and down the street for any signs of movement. I saw nothing, but from these slashed tires I assumed that we were being watched. Whoever they were, they knew when we were far enough away to vandalize the car. A minute later, Betty came out with a plastic bag. I saw 9 or 10 cartons of cigarettes in it and some plastic nips of Jack Daniels. She also had Coca-Cola and some water. "I thought you were grabbing a pack of cigarettes," I said, narrowing my eyes. 10 cartons? Why do we need 10 cartons for a 5-mile hike? "Oh, we don't need them," she said. "But you know, they're expensive down in Connecticut. Much cheaper in this town." "Yeah, I guess you can't beat free," I said, reaching into the bag and taking out a pack. We started walking out of town in silence. I didn't even hear an animal stir. The regular buzz of the insects that chirped and squeaked throughout the White Mountains was missing here. It gave the town a supernatural eeriness, as if we had wandered into an apocalyptic wasteland where even the crickets had gone to die. To break the monotony, I lit a cigarette. The flick of the lighter and the soft tread of our footsteps were the only sounds that we could hear for miles. As we got further down Main Street, the shops and houses started to thin out. Soon after we had passed the church, both sides of the street had turned to forest, and only an occasional house or farm broke the endless trees. The downtown area couldn't have been more than a quarter-mile long, but this town and the surrounding forest felt like it went on forever. "This is really spooky," Betty said, shattering the silence. I was glad for a break, though I felt eyes on me as she spoke, as if we had somehow violated the sanctity of a graveyard with laughter. "I've never experienced anything as weird as this," I said, whispering and getting close to Betty. I noticed that she also spoke in a quiet voice, and she constantly glanced behind and around. She smoked a lot of cigarettes, nervously lighting one after the other, and she drank 3 nips on the way, chasing them down with the Coke. I took one myself and I downed it. The burning liquid seemed to revive me somewhat and clear my head. I chugged some soda to get the taste out of my mouth. And Betty had opened her mouth to say something else when the screaming erupted from all around us. The sun had long disappeared behind the mountains, and we were surrounded by thick curtains of darkness. I couldn't see more than a few feet into the forest. Betty gripped my hand tightly. "Okay, now I'm really freaked out," she whispered into my ear. We had both stopped and stood, holding hands as shrieks echoed through the trees. The light breeze carried a smell that nearly made me gag, the smell of decay and blood. "And do you think it's a fox or a fisher cat or something?" I shook my head silently, then leaned close to her. "We're going to run," I said, back towards the town. "It's a lot closer. Ready?" She nodded grimly. "Go." We started sprinting away, our footsteps bouncing off the pavement, far too loud. The screaming drew closer and something broke through the outer boundary of the woods. With twigs crunching and branches snapping, I saw the silhouette emerge into the road to my left. The smell of rotting flesh seemed overwhelming now. I only saw her for a second, but I knew in that moment that she wasn't human. It looked like a woman, or at least like the corpse of one, but she was clearly alive in some form, running and shrieking, sending out wails of pure agony and horror. The eyes snapped onto me, and I met them for a brief moment. Even in the dim light of the moon and the stars, I could see that they were pure white, without pupils or irises, and yet they seemed to see everything even in the deepening shadows. Long stringy black hair ran down over her face and down her back. Papery skin hung tightly to the skull, and the mouth hung wide open, inhumanly wide, like the tendons and ligaments holding the jaw of the skull had been cut. The huge black pit of her mouth emanated those screams constantly, as if she didn't need to breathe. On the body, parts of the skin were missing. I could see the bones beneath. They were thin and fragile skin had broken. Purple and black sores shone from these spots. The long skeletal hand of the woman ended up in claw-like fingers, with the nails blackened and the bones sticking out at the end of each digit. She ran fast, gaining on us, and she wasn't alone. I could see dozens more bodies breaking through the tree line now, a deafening howling emanating from them as they ran. I was breathing hard by this point. I could see the first buildings of the town up ahead. We only had to make it another 100 paces and then we could lock ourselves in and barricade the doors and windows. I didn't dare look back, but I heard the screaming from just behind me. I felt a soft swipe across my back, the sharp, bony fingers dragging across the shirt for a brief moment. It gave me another adrenaline rush, and I pushed myself forward with all of my will, feeling my heart beating far too fast in my chest. I began to feel lightheaded and see flashes of white light every time that I blinked. I knew that I would pass out if I had to go much further. I hadn't gone running in over 10 years, probably since I was in high school, but I ran for my life just the same. And Betty was in better shape than me, and she had gained some ground. She glanced back as she sprinted down the middle of the dark street. I saw her point to the church. It stood just ahead, the doors already opened, as if waiting for us, as if it knew that we would be back. She veered sharply to the right and I followed close behind, panting and sweating like a madman. The doors were so close now. The shrieking behind me had been joined by a few others. With the last of my strength, I began an all-out sprint, hoping that I wouldn't trip over something and go flying into a car. It would mean the end of me, of that I was certain. We ran through the doors into the church. I turned around and saw that the creatures had gone. Their screaming cut off as soon as we had entered, and now I saw no sign of them. It was as if they had vanished. I shut the doors of the church just the same, turning a deadbolt to lock them. Betty had her phone out, turning on the flashlight app to help me see in the dark church. I would have to also check for auxiliary entrances, but it was a start just the same. And then I turned and I saw what Betty had already noticed: the desecration of this holy place. The statue of Jesus on his cross had been broken off at the bottom of the beam, and now hung upside down from a rope that extended to the high ceiling, dozens of feet above our heads. His face had been slashed and cut, his nose and eyes now missing, and on the front of his chest, I saw a strange symbol carved deeply into the wood with what looked like blood. The sigil looked like an upside-down triangle within a larger upside-down triangle and had lines curving out of the sides of the bottom. Connected to the lines of the larger triangle at the bottom, I saw a line curving like a J, and on the other side, another line curved like a backwards J. The lines extended outwards, curving over a V. Around the sigil sat a thick and black circle. It definitely seemed magical. like something from a medieval textbook on witchcraft. "That's the sigil of Lucifer," my wife said quietly. "How do you know that?" I asked, and she shrugged. "I read a couple of books on black magic when I was a teen," she said. "That one stuck with me for some reason. That symbol, it's eerie. I never forgot it." I looked over at the font at the front of the church. Instead of holy water, I saw that it was filled with blood. "I guess no one's crossing themselves in here today," I said, trying to break the harsh terror that threatened to overwhelm us. And then, as Betty moved her light around, I realized that we weren't alone in here. People sat in the pews, their heads bowed, silently praying. Dozens of people were in here with us, yet they made no noise, and no one turned their heads to look at us or say anything. An icy chill ran down my spine. I turned to Betty and I pointed at the people. "Yeah, I see them," she whispered and began to creep slowly forward. I took out my phone and turned down my light as well, moving silently a few feet behind her. I shone the light at the first pew of people and I gasped. They all had their throats cut. A waterfall of thick, coagulated blood stained the front of their bodies. The smell hit me at once, an overwhelming odor of rotting meat and iron. I gagged, turning to retch. Betty pulled me towards the back of the church. I searched for any other entrances, locking the ancient deadbolts on the doors. We ended up going to the rectory in the back, sitting on the priest's couch. There were no bodies in here, and no smell but the musty scent of an old building and books. "Well," Betty said, turning to me, barely concealing the terror in her eyes, "it looks like we found the townspeople. Some of them, anyways." I said nothing, but instead put my phone down and sat in the darkness with her, putting my arm around her while she cried. As she wept into my shoulder, I heard the siren start up again. It sounded muffled inside the church but still vibrated the floors and the walls all around us. I didn't know what the siren signified, but I doubted that it was anything good. After all, the last time that the siren had sounded, we had run into something horrible. Dozens of walking corpses with white eyes that seemed to look at us with thirst and hunger. But I had no plans, not anymore. We were unarmed and seemed to be in a relatively safe place. My main thought was that we should hide in here until the morning, when daylight arrived and made travel safer. We could always try jumping the police car or even finding a car where the tires weren't totally flat and jumping that to drive it out of town. I had seen dozens of car keys in the diner and one of them had to fit with one of the more reliable cars parked on the street. If I had to, I would drive my car on the rims as far as it would go and then abandon it once we were outside the city limits. Anything would be better than being trapped here for another night. The siren wound down again, its haunting echoes dissipating into the night. I turned to Betty, flipping my phone over to get some light. "Let's search this place," I said. "Maybe we can find a weapon." This is the priest's living quarters, I think, so that means there should be at least some knives for cooking somewhere around here. If we're lucky, maybe the guy even had a gun. This was a thought that I had considered already, going from house to house to search for guns. This was, after all, rural New Hampshire, deep in the mountains where people like to hunt, and where farmers would likely keep some sort of shotgun or rifle for pests. If we were armed, our chances of survival would rise exponentially, at least so I hoped. For all I knew, ammo would be as useless as a squirt gun against those things that we had seen coming out of the forest. My wife wiped away her tears and then she reached into her purse and pulled out her keychain. She dropped it into my hand. I looked at it for a moment, confused. "That black thing," she said, pointing at a small canister connected to the chain. It's pepper spray. I don't know how effective it is. I've had it for nearly 10 years. It might not even work at this point. I don't think pepper spray really goes bad though. It should still be able to stop someone in their tracks. Yeah, someone as in a human, I said. We don't even know if those things feel pain. Their eyes. I didn't need to finish the sentence. She had seen their strange cataract eyes. She knew as well as I did that we weren't dealing with the living. I got up, sighing. I took her hand and helped her up. We grabbed our phones and she grabbed her purse and plastic bag of goodies, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. It took her nearly 3 tries to get it lit. She reminded me of a Parkinson's patient in his final days. We explored the rectory area in silence, finding a small kitchen. As I had suspected, it had a knife block with some long and wicked blades. I took one for myself and gave one to Betty. We went back to the rectory and searched every drawer and closet, but I could find no sign of a gun or ammo. Feeling slightly better now that I at least had a knife, we went back to the chapel. I shone my phone's light across the immense chamber, and my heart leapt into my throat. The front doors stood wide open now, letting the dim moonlight stream into the nave. Even worse, the corpses were all gone. And while we were in the rectory, somebody had used blood to write a message across the wall, covering the stained glass windows and aged beams in letters 5 feet tall. The black sun awakens. As I stood there, gaping, not sure what to do, Betty grabbed my arm and pointed outside the door. "Look," she cried, a note of triumph in her voice. "Someone's coming." I saw with excitement that she was right. I felt a surge of hope rise in me so powerful that I felt lightheaded. Headlights streamed down the dark street, casting long, twisting shadows across the buildings. I grabbed her hand and we ran outside without a second thought. The car traveled slowly down Main Street, coming from the same direction that we had originally come. We ran out into the middle of the road and I started waving my arms frantically, trying to get the driver's attention. A chubby old man pulled up beside us, looking at us with suspicion and narrowing his eyes. I gestured for him to put his window down. He hesitated for a long moment, looking between me and my wife, and then lowered it 1/8 of an inch. I heard all of his doors lock as he quickly pressed the button. Does anyone live here?" he asked. "I need some gas. The map said that there's a station here, supposed to be 24 hours, but there's no one inside. Doesn't look like anybody's been inside in weeks. All the food in the refrigerators had started to rot and there's not even electricity. So," he trailed off. I didn't even know where to start. I certainly didn't want to start rambling about walking corpses and messages painted in blood. But Betty, always my smarter and better half, thought quickly instead. "We had a massive electrical failure," she said, lying smoothly and smiling at him with her disarming charm. I saw the old man relax slightly, though he still glanced over at me with suspicion from time to time. "We really need help. Our car broke down and everyone besides us was already evacuated." "Yeah," the old man said skeptically. "Makes sense, I guess. Okay, so you both live here?" I nodded, building on the lie. "Yeah, we used to, but we missed the evacuation. Can you please just give us a ride to the highway?" I said, giving him what I hoped was a neighborly smile. He frowned, the lines in his face deepening. "What's your name, friend?" he asked, not answering my question and refusing to roll down his window any more than the tiny crack that he made. "I'm Johnny Redfern, and this is my wife, Betty. Please, sir, we really need your help." "How come you two didn't just walk out of here?" he asked. "The highway is only a 10-minute drive. It's not exactly around the corner, but shouldn't take you more than a couple of hours to walk it. I swore inwardly. Of course, we had to get an old man who was as sharp as a tack. If he kept talking to us, he would inevitably pick up on our lies. In fact, he probably already had. The story wouldn't make much sense, especially when he kept driving and saw the messages painted in blood on the police station. And well, I'm not saying you're being dishonest or anything, God forbid. But if people were evacuated, why are all their cars still here? Did they walk out? Did they all take the bus? Sure looks like they've been here for a while. I froze, not knowing what to say in response. I looked over at Betty, her pretty dark eyes narrowing with concentration as she stared at the old man. "Sir, what's your name?" she asked him pleasantly, changing her face in a moment back to the beatific and friendly smile she always used in her job as a real estate agent for difficult customers. "Well, I'm Freddie Mackenzie," he said. He looked like he considered rolling the window down to shake our hands, but instead, he quickly looked away. "Okay, please listen to me, Freddie. Something strange is going on here and we don't know what it is. We really need your help. I'm afraid that if we stay in this town any longer, something really bad is going to happen to us," Betty said, her smile fading. Freddie's bright blue eyes shone with intelligence as he weighed her words, looking from my face to hers before frowning slightly and wrinkling his forehead. "Yeah, no, I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sure you two are very nice people, but I don't pick up hitchhikers, ever. I don't know you guys from Adam, but if you want, I can call you a tow truck when I get on the highway, or even a police officer, and they can sort this mess out. I really don't know what's going on here, and I don't want to know. This is none of my business, but I wish you both good luck." He put his car back in drive and rolled his window back up, waving in a friendly manner but not meeting our eyes. He pulled away at a snail's pace, going at least 10 miles under the speed limit as he drove down the road. "I should have maced him," Betty said bitterly, watching the old man's taillights as they grew smaller. "I really should have. I thought about it, you know." "What would that have accomplished?" I asked. "Well, it would have made me feel better," she said. We both laughed, an anxious and nervous release of tension that I felt I needed at that moment. A gunshot pierced the night. I jumped, almost falling on the sidewalk curb as I quickly backed off of the road. I grabbed Betty to steady myself. She was looking down the road at the old man's red brake lights. They cast a bloody glow across the main street. Another gunshot rang out and I could hear a loud hiss, as if a monstrous snake had just awakened. But it wasn't a snake. We watched Freddie's car as clouds of smoke and plumes of exhaust began rising from the engine, and the hissing grew louder. I realized something must have given in his engine when the bullet passed through. His tires looked fine, but even from this distance, I could see a puddle expanding around his car. I didn't know anything about cars, but from my meager knowledge, I assumed that it was likely coolant or transmission fluid. Either one was not good. "What should we do?" Betty asked, grabbing my hand tightly. "I'm not running in the direction of gunshots if that's what you're asking," I said quickly. "We should take cover. Let's go back to the church for now." "What about the old man?" she asked, more loudly now. "What's going to happen to him?" "We should worry about ourselves," I yelled at her, not meaning to raise my voice. She shrank back as if I had slapped her. I stepped forward, taking her hand and whispering, "Sorry, I didn't mean to get angry." "What if he dies because we did nothing?" she asked. "Well, he did nothing to help us," I said. "Well, he was going to call for help at least. I can't really blame him for not picking up two wild-eyed strangers with a BS story in the middle of an abandoned town." I kept watching his car, but he didn't get out. "Do you think he was hit?" she asked. "God, I don't know," I said, feeling like things were quickly spiraling out of control. Our potential rescue had turned into a potential burden. Luck was not on our side today. The old man's taillights changed as he put his car in reverse. He tried to slowly back up in our direction, but the engine made loud knocking sounds when he pressed the gas, and the thick cloud of smoke began to expand, rising up in the air in huge, billowing plumes. I heard metallic groaning sounds as the knocking died down, and then his car had stopped moving, and the engine shut off by itself. He hadn't managed to reverse more than 20 feet in that time. I wondered what he was thinking at that moment, whether he thought we were a part of some band of robbers who had staged a gunman up ahead. If I were in his shoes, I felt certain that that would be my first assumption. After all, who else in the town was there to blame? A secret gunman in Vandu who hid in buildings or in forests. Yeah, and corpses who got up and moved around. But nobody in their right mind would buy that story, at least until they had seen it for themselves. Okay, screw it. Let's go get the old man out of his car and make sure that he's... I started to say, but then the siren came on again, seemingly even louder and shriller than before. I covered my ears with my hands, and without thinking, I ran towards the old man's car, hoping that I wouldn't live to regret the decision. By the time that I had run through Main Street, the siren had started to die out again. It seemed to be getting shorter every time that it ran. I didn't know what to think about that. I tried to justify it by saying perhaps the building where the siren was located ran on generators and they were running out of fuel. So to compensate, they ran the siren less and less every time. But why run it at all? There was no tornado here, no hurricanes or tsunami. It felt like I was missing an essential piece of the puzzle. As I got to within 10 feet of his car, I saw the old man moving inside, apparently unharmed. Freddie stumbled out of the driver's seat, shaking and pale. He looked at me with wide, accusing eyes. "What did you do?" he asked me. "I'm warning you, I have a gun." I looked around at his hands and next to his seat. I saw no gun, and I assumed that he might be bluffing. However, I wasn't going to risk my life on it. I still had the butcher's knife tucked into the back of my pants, the blade looped through my leather belt, and I'd even pulled my shirt over it so the old man wouldn't see it and get scared. I put my hands up and backed away slowly. His eyes narrowed even more as if he suspected a trick. "Please, I'm just trying to help," I said. "My wife and I were not actually from here, we're from Connecticut. We came here just like you, just to stop for a minute. But somebody slashed our tires and this town has some strange things happening in it. I can't explain it. That siren, every time that it goes off." I didn't know what to say next. "I think it's a warning or perhaps a signal. Every time it goes off, we see people walking around. Maybe they're a part of a cult or something else, but we need to get to safety now. There's a church just down the street with deadbolts on all the doors. It can be locked from the inside and maybe even barricaded. We should go there immediately. If you won't come with us, that's your decision. But I'll tell you right now, you probably won't survive out here." "Is that a threat?" he asked, his blue eyes blazing with anger. His chubby face reddened and even his bald head had a crimson hue. "Okay, fine," I tried. I said, giving up and turning to leave. "Stay here and die." I started walking away and not looking back. I heard heavy footsteps slapping against the pavement and suddenly he was at my side, walking with me. He sighed heavily, the redness slowly fading out of his face. "I'll come with you," he said. "But if this is a trick, know that I intend to report all of this to the police as soon as possible." "My friend," I said, quickening my step and starting to jog towards the church. "If the police were coming, Don't you think they would already be here? After we got into the church and locked all the doors, we saw dark silhouettes walking past these stained glass windows. They surrounded the church, their strange gait revealing their inhuman nature even based on their shadows. I knew that it was the corpses, like the ones that I had seen out in the woods. Off in the distance, one of them started to scream, a shrill, piercing noise that carried on the wind. It sounded like she was here, standing right next to me in the church. I shuddered. I heard a few of the corpses respond until it sounded like the shrieking came from all around the perimeter of the building. Yet they didn't try to get in. If they had smashed through these stained glass windows, they could have easily crawled through, yet they didn't. At least, not yet. Soon I heard a sound like a man crying in pain. This scream sounded far different than the empty banshee wails of the corpses. I looked through a pane of clear glass and saw the woman from the forest, the walking nightmare with the black matted hair and white cataract eyes. Next to her, I saw two children, twins from the look of them, dressed in nearly identical clothing. Two little boys holding hands and walking behind her. The skin on their faces had mostly peeled off, showing the eternally grinning skulls underneath. Their eyes had turned white with drops of thick black blood dripping down their face like tears. Their bodies looked partially decomposed, just like the woman, with sharp finger bones poking out through the skin. On their hands, I could see the tendons and ligaments and muscle underneath, in places where the skin had been eaten away. In front of them, I saw a man crawling on his hands and knees out of the dark forest on the perimeter of town. His leg looked broken, the area around his knee twisted at a 45-degree angle. Matted blood is soaking into the denim. By the time I realized what I was looking at, all three had caught up to him. The woman's corpse gnashed her teeth as she drew near, biting at the air and smiling. The twins looked serene, as if they were just going on a walk to the playground. They didn't hurry or run, knowing their prey was injured and doomed. The man looked back at them, an expression of sheer terror twisting his face. And then all three were on him, eating him alive from the legs and stomach. His agony-filled shrieks shattered the night. I turned away. Within a couple minutes, everything had gone quiet again, but I saw dozens more of those silhouettes passing on Main Street, or coming from the graveyard behind the church. I wondered just how many of them we were up against. Over time, Freddy warmed up to us. He seemed to realize that we weren't lunatics who were going to stab him and eat his heart while praying to a serpent god in Aramaic. He ended up being much more talkative than I would have expected. When we talked to him in the car, he came across as an aloof curmudgeon who wouldn't have helped his own mother if she fell down. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said, his eyes widening, as if he were telling a ghost story around a campfire. "Roanoke. Those people disappeared without a trace." "I'm pretty sure that they just interbred with the natives," Betty said. "The Mary Celeste was similar to this, though. The crew just disappeared from the ship in the middle of the ocean. No one knows where they went." The two of them acted much more relaxed than I felt. My nerves felt jangled, and I just kept waiting for the next siren. Or maybe the gunman who'd shout out Freddy's engine block would show up, armed with a semi-automatic rifle and carrying buckets of blood around with him to paint messages whenever he felt like it. I could see him in my mind's eye, a nut job in a ski mask, two dark eyes glaring out at me, his heart filled with bloodlust and murder. "These people didn't really disappear though, did they?" I said, turning to look at them. "We found the corpses of a couple dozen of them in here, right in the church, and we've seen more of them outside." "But where's the rest of them?" Betty asked. Freddy looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, there's way more than a few dozen people living in this town. Where are all the bodies? Maybe the rest of the town isn't even dead." You didn't tell me that somebody staged bodies in this church, Freddie said accusingly, looking at Betty. She shrugged. So? So maybe, he lowered his voice. This place is haunted. You ever think of that? Betty laughed out loud at that, and even I cracked a smile. My friend, I said, this whole town is apparently haunted. I wouldn't worry about the church. I don't know how much time passed, but after they talked for a few more minutes, we ended up just sitting there in silence. Betty and I smoked cigarettes, and Freddie drank some of the whiskey that she had grabbed. And just to steel my nerves, he said, and he looked like he needed it. He was still shaking, and he would often get up and pace around in a circle, muttering to himself and sending dirty looks towards the blood-stained pews. Ever since we had told him about the bodies, he had seemed much more uncomfortable and frightened. I knew how he felt. I felt the same restlessness and terror within me. It seemed like we were trying to hide in the closet as the house burned down around us. But what else could we do? Soon that decision would be taken out of our hands. I realized that the church seemed to be getting brighter. Freddie and Betty didn't notice for a few moments as they had just started up another conversation, this time about the sigil painted on the body of Jesus hanging upside down from the ceiling. But I noticed the lightning immediately. For a second, I thought maybe the electricity had come back on, but that the lights were just dim, or that maybe somebody was driving outside and their high beams shone through the windows. But I quickly realized that this light had a different texture. It was almost like a black light, giving off an intense, purplish glow over everything that it touched. Betty had gone silent, her mouth open in silent awe. Freddie rubbed his hand over his bald head, opening his mouth. "Oh, what?" he said. He stopped his pacing, nervously smoothing out his shirt. "What is this? Is it some sort of stage trick?" "Not from me," I said, looking around the church. All the dark corners were now illuminated, shining with the eerie light. I could see the bloodstains glowing on the pews, looking almost black against the shining mahogany hue of the wood. The sigil of Lucifer shone with an intensity that dwarfed everything else in the church. It was so bright that I had to turn away. The light that it gave off was a dark red, and when I closed my eyes, I could still see that crimson symbol burned into my sight. As I looked out the side window, I saw that the light seemed to be coming from the forest at the edge of town, deep behind thick groves of evergreens and muddy swamps. It felt almost like looking into a second sun, and I quickly moved away from the window, my vision still swarming with bright dots and white light. The strange slogan that I had seen painted on the police station came into my mind. "We follow the black sun." Was this what they meant? "I want to go investigate," I said. And they looked at me as if I was crazy. "We can't just stay here forever. Maybe we're supposed to figure this place out, or stop what's happening." "And who, may I ask, gave you this divine order? God?" Freddie asked, smiling. "No one is supposed to do anything except survive. If you want to die." He never got to finish as the siren sound had started up again. I realized as I listened intently to the shrill, deafening wail that it appeared to be coming from the same place as this eerie light that flooded the town. It shook the floors and walls and caused the upside-down statue of Jesus to start moving from side to side, swaying like a pendulum. As soon as it had stopped, I heard crashing at the back door. It sounded as if dozens of people threw their bodies against the locked doors that led out the rear entrance towards the graveyard. Yet nobody tried to break down the front doors. Without thinking, I undid the front door's deadbolt and ran outside, not looking back to see if they would follow me. With the light flooding in, I could see much more of the town illuminated. Looking into the cop car, I realized that it wasn't empty at all. The body of a police officer sat in the driver's seat, lying sideways so his head rested on the center console. He had a single gunshot through his temple, and I saw the gun still in his hand. I opened the driver's side door and a horrible odor of rotten eggs, rancid meat, and feces hit me immediately. I held my breath, trying not to gag. I took the gun from his hand and quickly undid his belt, pulling it off. I turned and saw Freddy and Betty behind me, pale and watchful, looking terrified as they continuously glanced back at the church. "Hide," I said quickly. I got on my belly and slid under the cop car, not looking back to see if they would follow my orders. If they didn't, they would probably die. As soon as I was underneath it, a gun in one hand and a heavy police belt with mace, a taser, and extra ammo in the other, I saw bodies stream out the front door of the church. Many were no more than skeletons with some tendons still clinging to the bones, yet they were still able to walk. They moved quickly, looking around with empty eye sockets and rotting faces. Betty had by this point crawled underneath beside me. I turned and saw her, watching the corpses with wide, girlish eyes. I didn't see where Freddy had gone. The corpses emerging from the church split off in groups, going in different directions. After a few minutes, none remained on the street, at least from what I could see. Looking back and forth quickly, the pistol extended in my right hand, I slid out from under the police car. I took the weapons and ammo off the belt, giving Betty a taser and another canister of mace. "Give the extra mace to Freddy," I whispered. "Where is Freddy?" A half smile crossed her face and she pointed to the dumpster in an alley behind us. Quietly, I walked over and opened the lid, appearing inside. I saw Freddy, bugs writhing in his hair, a banana peel stuck to his chest. The smell from inside the dumpster was bad, though not nearly as bad as the rotting corpse smell from the police car. Freddy climbed out, grumbling and wiping himself off. Betty gave him the cop's mace canister, and I started walking toward the source of the eerie black light, hoping to find answers. Though this happened 3 months ago, I still question my decision that day, for that was the moment when I sealed our fates. The moment that I set my mind on walking towards the black sun, I ensured that we would see hell itself. "I really don't want to go in there," Freddy said, his old man's face wrinkling in fear. He grabbed my hand tightly. "Please listen to me. You don't want to go in there either. Have you seen what's happening in this town?" "I doubt that we'll survive much longer trying to hide," I said. "Whatever's happening here seems to be speeding up. At first, it was just a few corpses guarding the road out of town. Now it's dozens of them, and it seems like those in the graveyard are all changed now, walking around and hunting. What will you do when it's hundreds of corpses streaming through every building and road? Where will you hide?" He opened his mouth to say something but then closed it again. "Look, I can't force you to come with us," I said. "If you don't want to, you can stay here alone. Betty gave you the pepper spray and I'm sure you'll have no problem fighting off hundreds of hungry walking corpses with it. Right?" He sighed heavily. "I'll come with you, fine," he said. "But if we get ambushed, I'm running. I should have never come to this town, I knew it. I had enough gas to get home, but I thought to myself, why not? It's cheaper around here. Now my car is totaled, I'm trapped without any way to call for help. And you want me to go into that creepy forest to inspect a bizarre light." "You think we want to be here?" Betty asked. "Johnny's just trying to find us a way out or a way to survive. We already tried running, but the corpses have surrounded the roads. We tried hiding in the church, but they ended up breaking down the door. This is our last option. If this fails..." She didn't need to finish the sentiment. We all understood what she meant. My stomach was growling from not having eaten all day and I felt tired and weak. I ignored all of it and immediately started walking towards the edge of the woods. After a few moments, I heard their footsteps close behind me. As we got closer to the black sun, the forest changed from the idyllic firs, junipers, and white pine of the forest into a monstrous wasteland, something out of a nightmare. The needles of the evergreens and the decomposing leaves and dark soil of the ground transformed into a thick, scaly covering. I shone my light, kneeling close to it. To my horror, I saw what looked like blood vessels passing through, expanding and contracting slightly as some unseen heart pumped black fluid into the destroyed earth. The crust itself looked dark red, and it covered everything on the ground. I tried knocking on the crust with my knuckles. It felt slightly sticky and as hard as concrete. The trees and plants had also changed. The bark of the trees had turned a pale, ghostly white. Their leaves and needles had fallen off, and the branches stood like skeletal arms, stretching upwards to the sky. Thick rivulets of black fluid dripped from the bark and branches of all the trees. The ferns and pricker bushes and other small plants had also turned white, as pale as writhing maggots. Small drops of the black fluid fell from the changed leaves of the ferns and shrubs, dripping onto the ground. "This reminds me of kudzu in a way," Freddy said, standing behind my wife and me. His eyes were wide and he kept gazing around uncertainly. He didn't look at us, though. He constantly glanced back towards Main Street, as if thinking about booking it and leaving us alone. "What's kudzu?" my wife asked, still as curious as ever. "It's a plant from Asia. It grows in the south a lot and it takes over entire areas. It's like a vine that climbs everything and suffocates all the other plants," he said. "This looks a little different than that," I said sarcastically. I saw Freddy's knuckles turn white from gripping the mace canister as a stick snapped in the distance. He was terrified, and it would likely only take the smallest thing to send him running. I knew exactly how he felt. The light from the black sun became so bright as we walked forwards that I no longer needed my phone. Trying to conserve the battery, I turned the flashlight off and put it away, seeing Betty doing the same. Fred followed behind us, hesitant. As we got closer to the source of the mystery, his anxiety seemed to grow. "You know what they say about stragglers, Freddy?" I asked, trying to break the grim mood. He shook his head. "And they get eaten first." After that, his pace quickened and he stuck close to us. I hadn't seen a single animal yet or heard a cricket or a bird. There were no bats flying around the dead and bleeding trees, no owls hooting in the distance or mosquitoes swarming around us. I wondered where the animals had gone. Most likely, I thought to myself, they had fled, unlike me. It seemed to me that they were the smart ones in this decision. As if conjured by the thought, I saw movement below a thick cluster of ferns. I put my hand up, the universal signal for stop. My wife and Freddy paused without a word. I got on my knees, taking my phone back out and turning the light on. It shone under the leaves. I saw a possum barely clinging to life. Surrounding it were tiny creatures. They weren't like any life form that I had ever seen on Earth. Where the light fell on them, they started chittering, excitedly raising their voices and turning their tiny faces towards me. They were no bigger than a Barbie doll, but with dozens of them in a pack. They had apparently taken down an animal much larger than themselves. They had gray, chitinous shells with glowing white eyes. Sharp, crab-like pincers covered in fresh blood clicked open and closed rapidly. Their tiny legs curved outwards, ending in razor-like feet. Their bow-legged gait made them waver from side to side as they ran around the possum, turning their tiny heads towards me from time to time and clicking their small mouths. The possum was nearly dead, and it didn't even try to run or fight. It languidly raised a paw or its head, and then the attack would begin again. The light in its eyes had gone out. Dozens of deep gashes showed all over its body. Its ragged breathing would stop for a few seconds and then start again once one of the tiny creatures shoved its claws inside, opening a tiny mouth filled with fangs to suck the blood that poured out. I quickly backed away. Betty had seen it too, and a look of horror crossed across her face. "What are those things?" she asked. "I have no idea," I said. Freddie didn't seem the least bit interested in seeing the creatures or the dying possum. He had stayed back a few feet, constantly checking all directions as if expecting an ambush. Without a word, I kept walking, not wanting to see such a horrible and sad scene. I considered sending a bullet in the possum's head to put it out of its misery. I looked over at Betty, who always loved animals, and noticed a tear rolling down her cheek. I realized that I could see something through the pale and skeletal trees. It looked like a clearing, and in the center I could just barely make out a huge orb, floating and spinning over the crusted red ground. An intense, purplish-black light swirled and jumped inside of it, sending out bolts of lightning into the surrounding field. Yet there was no sound, no thunder or crashing of branches. I pointed and Betty raised her head, her mouth agape in wonder. Freddie apparently had already seen it. All the color had drained from his face, and I thought for a moment that he might faint. "I think we're near," I said. "That must be the black sun." As I walked out into the clearing, I felt eyes on me. I thought that I caught glimpses of white eyes behind the dead trees and bushes, but whenever I turned to look, they were gone. Nevertheless, I quickly realized that we weren't alone in the clearing. It extended for nearly a quarter-mile with the black sun directly in the middle. Thick black blood vessels as wide as a man pulsed all around my feet, thousands of them embedded into the dark red crust of the earth. And as my eyes adjusted to the intense black light, I realized more of the townspeople were here, tortured and dying. It looked like we had found the missing. They were impaled on sharpened sticks 10 feet tall that surrounded the black sun in a circle. They loomed over me, choking or pleading. I saw men, women, and children. The one nearest to me, an old woman still wearing the tattered rag of her clothes, raised her head and looked down at me, her eyes white and empty. "Get out while you still can," she said, coughing up blood that dribbled down her chin. The stake had been driven below her legs, and the sharp end rose out of her left shoulder. He's mad, oh God, he's killed us all. We should have done something, we should have tried." Her eyelids started fluttering, and she began to shake and seize on the stake. Within seconds, she had passed, her head falling down limply, still staring at me, her eerie white eyes still open. I hadn't noticed before, but I saw the black, pulsating blood vessels extended to each one of the victims. They had crawled up the stakes and wrapped around the feet and legs of each person. I couldn't see the bottom of their bodies, but I saw that these nightmarish arteries had eaten holes inside each of the bodies. They seemed to suck on their blood, draining the victims as they died. "And you still think we should have come here, Johnny?" Freddie asked in my ear. "Do me a favor, please. If we get captured, just put one right in my head. I don't want to end up like that." He motioned to the old woman, who still stared blankly down at us, looking at me like some demented scarecrow. I didn't answer, gazing around the hundreds of bodies that surrounded the black sun like these spokes on a wheel. Standing next to the orb, I saw what looked to be a little boy, no older than 9 or 10. But he was transformed, no longer human. His skin looked translucent. Black veins and arteries stood out in his neck and face, and his eyes were white like the others and yet different. They weren't the dull, cataract white of a corpse, but shone with their own inner luminosity, like twin stars floating in the void. "My name is Kindred," the boy said, smiling. "I think you've arrived just in time. The black sun is almost done feeding for now, and it'll send out its call in a moment. I congratulate you on making it so far. The others didn't do so well. The black sun has a corrupting influence, let's say. His grin widened at this. But it doesn't seem to affect you three as much. Now, why do you think that is? None of us answered him. I gripped the gun tightly, feeling my finger on the trigger. It gave me a sense of power and relief, even though I didn't know if it would have any effect on such a creature. Betty was the first to speak, stepping forward. She didn't stutter or tremble as she stared into the boy's eyes. "Do you live here? Where's your family?" she asked. The boy's smile seemed to widen further, stretching inhumanly across his small face. "Oh, my family's dead," he said. "Thank the Lord Lucifer for small favors. My father was a terrible man. He used to take his anger out on me physically, and one day he went too far, and he killed me. My mother covered it up. But I was offered a way to return the favor. Lucifer came to me in a vision as I died at the bottom of the stairs, my neck broken, paralyzed from the fall. He told me that if I gave him my soul that I could come back in power and glory. Those who hurt me would fall first. The neighbors and congregation that had ignored my pleas for help would suffer also. And the church, full of hypocrites and liars, would become a testament to my becoming and his power. My father, a police officer who hoped to cover up my death, was the first to go. When the black sun appeared in the forest, it began to twist their minds. His mind, already damaged, was easy to push over the edge. Lucifer convinced him to end his own life, and you probably saw him back there in his car in town. As the black sun grew in power, it brought the dead back to life, an army for me to use in my becoming. Some of the townspeople tried to hide in the church, but the black sun put them to sleep, and I came through and ended them one by one in the pews. Now it expands and its power grows. The dead rise further and further away. Soon all the corpses in this town will follow my command, except for, of course, those needed to feed the black sun, these puppets on the stakes. He motioned to the hundreds of bodies. And then he closed his eyes and the black sun began to grow. Its orb grew and the dark, silent lightning began to strike the impaled bodies and trees with a feverish intensity. I had to turn my head away, but I still saw the branching lightning strikes even through my closed eyes. Kindred didn't flinch, but instead seemed to feed off the energy that it put out. His smile grew wider and his white eyes seemed to burn with an inner light. It was as if I could see a fire of white flames inside his head, or perhaps a sun. "We've had to feed it," he said, "and after it's fed, it sleeps. But its slumber shortens with every cycle, and the energy it puts out grows. Every time it awakens, it brings back the dead in an ever-widening circle. Soon we'll have an army of fearless soldiers, soldiers who obey every command regardless of the danger of death. For what do they have to fear?" I saw corpses walking out of the forest, forming a circle around the black sun. The woman with the black matted hair and white eyes that I had seen earlier stood next to Kindred. She put her hand on his shoulder and he looked up at her fondly. "My mother, she's much more useful than death. She never could stand up to my father, but everything happens for a reason." He said this last part wistfully, a slight smile returning to his boyish, mutated face. And then the black sun began to make a shrill noise, an ear-splitting siren-like sound that made me back up instinctively. I realized that what we had heard in the town was not a siren at all, but the call of the satanic orb, spinning deep within the forest. A smell like ozone filled the clearing, mixing with the rotting odor of the dead. Kindred didn't seem to mind the noise or the smells. His face had returned to the same placid expressionless state that it had been in when I first saw him. The siren call died down much faster this time, and soon the forest had returned to silence. For a moment we stared at each other, his burning white eyes meeting mine. And then he turned away, giving an apathetic wave in our direction. "Kill them all," he said, Feed them to the sun. As soon as he had turned, I raised the pistol and fired. The first shot went low and it caught him in the knee. He cried out, a very human sound, falling onto the crusted red ground. The army of undead that he had summoned rushed forward towards us. I pulled out the knife and I threw it to Freddy. "You better be ready," I said quickly, and then they were on us. I shot the black-haired woman in the head, the one that Kindred had called his mother, and she fell backwards, thick, clotted blood exploding out of the back of her head. Freddy stabbed with the knife, hitting a tall man in the eye. With a sickening sound, he pulled it out, sending droplets of red scattering in all directions. But a dozen hands grabbed him, pulling down as he screamed for help. I shot the last few rounds into those nearest, but for each one I killed, another 3 would swarm in and take their place. I tried to run forward towards Kindred, but hands grabbed me from all directions. The strength of those hands quickly stopped me in my tracks. In the chaos, Betty had escaped, crawling under their grasping hands and through decomposing skeletal legs. They were focused on us, those with the weapons, and she used the opportunity to run. She sprinted towards Kindred, who was healing quickly. The blood had already stopped pouring from the bullet wound in his leg, and he was slowly rising to his feet, scowling and furious. In horror, I watched her as she tackled a small body, and they both went flying into the black sun. For a moment, nothing had happened. They seemed suspended on the surface, defying gravity. Betty's mouth an O of surprise. Kindred's a look of pure hatred. And then there was an explosion of light and heat, and a gateway opened in front of our eyes. On the other side, I saw a vast, terrifying landscape. Rocky cliffs extended up to the sky. Blood-red clouds rained fire and lava down on the dead rocks below. Thousands of people swarmed across the barren landscape, burning, screaming, their skin melting off and their hair on fire. But as soon as they had fallen and stopped moving, they would heal in a matter of seconds. And then it would start again, and they would rise, trying to escape the fire. And then the portal started to close, narrowing and shrinking. I screamed for my wife, telling her to get out of there to run, but my words caught in my throat, and soon it had shrunk to a pinpoint of violent purplish light. And seconds later it was gone, and the corpses holding me fell limply to the ground, landing on their faces and backs, their eyes shutting. I was alone with Freddy, horrified and screaming for my wife, but in my heart I knew that I would never see her again. The black sun had taken her as it had taken the lives of so many others. I cursed Kindred, cursed the sun, and the townspeople and his father. Surrounded by hundreds of rotting corpses, we started the long walk back to town in silence, my tears feeling cold on my cheeks.